Although the front was now a continuous one, however, it did recede quite a long way west in its northern part. On 13th March, the enemy began another mass attack, this time with 8 rifle divisions and 2 independent armoured brigades up. While we were able to knock out 136 tanks in the first 3 days, a number of crises developed. The bitterness of the fighting may be judged from the fact that the regiments of 46th Division, which bore the main brunt of the assault on this occasion, had to beat off anything from 10 to 22 attacks between them during the same 3 days. On 18th March, 42 Corps had to report that it could no longer withstand any major attacks. As the newly constituted 22 Panzer Division had arrived behind this front in the meantime, having been allocated to 11th Army by OKH, we decided that the extreme tenseness of the situation justified our employing it on a counterattack. Our object was to regain the main fighting line we had originally held across the actual neck of the Parpach Isthmus, and thereby to cut off the 2 or 3 enemy divisions located in the northern salient. Together with a very small tactical staff, I had moved into a command post close behind the threatened Parpach front in order to watch the preparations for the counterattack being handled by 42 Corps headquarters. The attack, which took place on 20th March and was to be supported on either flank by 46 and 170 infantry divisions, proved a failure. The new armoured division ran straight into a Soviet assembly area in the early morning mists. Obviously, we had been wrong to throw it into a major battle before putting it through its paces in exercises with its parent formation. While this attack, despite its being directed at a relatively limited objective, miscarried, the same division came fully up to expectations only a few weeks later, after completing its training under warlike conditions as part of a larger formation. But what else could we have done in the circumstances but risk committing it to battle? At least it had given the enemy a severe shock and checked his preparations for another big attack at just the critical moment. When the latter did materialise on 20th of March, it was beaten off by 42 Corps. This time the enemy had committed only 4 divisions, either because he had temporarily exhausted his other formations or because he preferred to limit his objective now that tanks had been seen on our side for the first time. In the meantime, while 22 Panzer Division was out of the line for a rest and refit, the advance elements of 28 Light Division also arrived behind the front. We could now face any new enemy attack with equanimity. The new Light Divisions, unlike their predecessors, were no longer a compromise between an armoured and a motorised division, but were closer in structure and equipment to a mountain division. They were later renamed Pursuit Divisions. Author. It came, and this was the enemy's last effort to reconquer the Crimea, on 9th of April, launched by between 6 and 8 rifle divisions and supported by 160 tanks. By 11th of April it had been beaten off, with heavy losses to the enemy. With that, the enemy's offensive capacity in this part of the theatre was finally spent. The stout-hearted divisions, which had seen this defensive battle through to a successful conclusion despite the tremendous strains it imposed on them, were now able to relax, even though they could not be taken out of the line. Army headquarters, on the other hand, turned from an arduous winter of unprecedented trials and crisis to the next task it had to tackle, that of preparing its own offensive for the final expulsion of the Russians from the Crimea. Between the penultimate and last defensive battle in the Kerch Peninsula, Marshal Antonescu had come out to the Crimea and gone round with me on a tour of the Romanian divisions and the Sevastopol front. In his soldierly way, he made an excellent impression, and the senior Romanian officers seemed to go in mortal fear of him. I was particularly grateful for his promise of 2 more Romanian divisions, since apart from the 2 German divisions which had already arrived, 22 Panzer and 28 Light, OKH was unable to provide any further forces for the projected offensive. According to OKH directives, the final expulsion of the Soviets from the Crimea, including Sevastopol, was intended to preface the grand offensive which the Supreme Command planned to launch in the southern sector of the Eastern Front. 11th Army's first concern was obviously to destroy the enemy in the Kerch Peninsula. One reason for this was the impossibility of predicting how long an operation to clear Sevastopol would take. The most important one, however, was that the Kerch front, being the easiest to reinforce, continued to constitute the main threat to 11th Army. The enemy here could be given no time to recover from the losses of his abortive attacks. Sevastopol would have to be shelved until the Soviet forces in the Kerch Peninsula had been wiped out. The relative strengths of the Russian and German forces in the Crimea, however, gave no grounds for any great optimism regarding the outcome of these two big undertakings. The enemy had 3 armies in the Crimea under the command of a Crimean front headquarters, which appeared to have been only recently formed and was probably located in Kerch. The Sevastopol fortress continued to be defended by the Coast Army, whose strength we had ascertained in February to be 7 rifle divisions, 1 rifle brigade, 2 naval brigades, and 1 dismounted cavalry division. During our Kerch offensive, all we would have available to contain these forces on the northern and eastern fronts of the fortress were 54 corps and the newly arrived 19 Romanian Division, which had been put there to free 50 German Division for Kerch. The only force left on the southern front of Sevastopol would be 72 Infantry Division. The Romanian Mountain Corps, with only 4 Mountain Brigade under command, had to defend the entire south coast of the Crimea against surprise attacks from the sea. Thus, 11th Army was having to strip the other fronts bare in order to attack at Kerch in the greatest possible strength. On the Kerch front, the enemy still had his 44th and 51st Armies. At the end of April 1942, they comprised 17 rifle divisions, 3 rifle brigades, 2 cavalry divisions, and 4 independent armoured brigades, an aggregate of 26 formations. Against this formidable array, we were able to commit merely 5 German infantry divisions, inclusive of 50 division from Sevastopol, and 22 Panzer division. These were augmented by the newly arrived 7 Romanian corps, consisting of 19 Romanian division, 8 Romanian cavalry brigade, and 10 Romanian division, the last named having been moved over from the west coast. As the usefulness of these Romanian forces in an offensive role was limited, the numerical disparity in the forthcoming offensive, now being planned under the code name Bustard, was increased still further. It also had to be borne in mind that the attack through the Parpach Gap must be a purely frontal one in the initial stages, as the seas on either side excluded any possibility of outflanking. What was more, the enemy had echeloned his defences in considerable depth. How were we in the circumstances, and in view of the enemy's superiority of at least 2-1, to achieve our object of destroying both his armies? One thing was clear. Neither a frontal push against the 2 enemy armies nor even a simple breakthrough could get us anywhere. If, after losing his Parpach positions, the enemy should manage to reform his front anywhere else, our operation would inevitably be halted. The broader the Kerch Peninsula became as one went east, the more the enemy would be able to make his numerical superiority felt. Our total of 6 German divisions might suffice for an attack through a mere 11-mile gap at Parpach, where the enemy could not put in all his forces simultaneously. But how should we fare further east when it came to fighting on a 25-mile front? The object must be, then, not only to break through the enemy's Parpach front and achieve penetration in depth, but also to destroy either the main bulk or at least a substantial part of his formations in the process of the first breakthrough. In this respect, the enemy himself offered us an opening. In his southern sector, between the Black Sea and Khorasan, he was, in the main, still sitting in the strongly prepared defences of his original Parpach front. His northern front, on the other hand, protruded well beyond the latter in a wide curve reaching as far west as Kiev, and dating from the time when the enemy had overrun 18 Romanian division. That the Soviet commander had considered the likelihood of our trying to cut off this bulge was clear from the way he had distributed his troops. According to our intelligence reports, he had massed 2/3 of his forces, both in the line and in reserve, in or behind his northern sector. In the south, however, there were only 3 divisions in the line and 2 or 3 in reserve. quite likely the abortive attack by 22 Panzer Division earlier on, the aim of which had been to cut off the enemy front in the region west of Khoy-Asan, was the reason for these dispositions. Such was the situation on which 11th Army based its assault plan for Operation Bustard. We intended to make our decisive thrust not immediately in the area where the front protruded west, but down in the southern sector, along the Black Sea coast. In other words, in the place where the enemy would be least expecting it. This task was to devolve on 30 corps, composed of 28 light, 132 and 50 infantry, and 22 panzer divisions. Although 170 infantry division would have to remain in the central sector in the initial phase in order to deceive the enemy, it too would subsequently follow through in the south. The plan was that 30 corps should break through the Parpach positions with 3 divisions up and exploit over the deep anti-tank ditch in an eastward direction to enable 22 Panzer Division to cross this obstacle. Once the latter had moved up, the corps would wheel north and drive into the flank and rear of the enemy forces concentrated in the northern sector. Then, in cooperation with 42 Corps and 7 Romanian Corps, it would finally surround the enemy on the north coast of the peninsula. The protection of 30 Corps' eastern flank against enemy attacks from the direction of Kirch was to be the responsibility of a mobile formation, Brigade Group Grodek, which was made up of German and Romanian motorized units. It was to discharge its task offensively by advancing rapidly towards Kerch, since this would also serve to forestall any attempt by enemy elements in the rear to take evasive action. In order to facilitate the difficult initial breakthrough at Parpach, 11th Army had made provisions for what was probably the first sea-borne assault boat operation of its kind. A battalion travelling by assault boats from Feodosia was to be dropped in the rear of the Parpach positions at first light. The decisive attack by the Corps was to be supported not only by strong artillery, but also by the whole of 8 air corps. 8 air corps, which also included strong anti-aircraft units, was by its structure the most powerful and hard-hitting Luftwaffe formation available for support of military operations. Its commanding general, Baron Verser Richthofen, was certainly the most outstanding Luftwaffe leader we had in World War II. He made immense demands on the units under his command, but always went up himself to supervise any important attack they made. Furthermore, one was constantly meeting him at the front, where he would visit the most forward units to weigh up the possibilities of giving air support to ground operations. We always got on extremely well together, both at 11th Army and later on at Southern Army Group. I remember Verser Richthofen's achievements and those of his Air Corps with the utmost admiration and gratitude. On the rest of the Parpach front, 42 Corps and 7 Romanian Corps had the task of simulating an attack in order to pin the enemy down. As soon as a breakthrough had been effected in the south, they were both to join in the main assault. The success of the operation depended on 2 things. The first was our ability to keep the enemy thinking that our decisive attack would come in the north until it was too late for him to back out of the trap or throw his reserves into the southern sector. The second was the speed with which 30 Corps, and in particular 22 Panzer Division, carried out the northward thrust. The first of these requirements was achieved by extensive deception tactics. Apart from wireless deception, these involved laying on a sham artillery preparation in the central and northern sectors and moving troops around in the same area. Apparently they were entirely successful, as the bulk of the enemy's reserves remained behind his northern wing until it was too late for them to move. Immediately before the offensive began, we lost our highly experienced Chief of Staff, General Wöhler, who had been such an invaluable support in the difficult days of the previous winter, and played a leading role in the preparation of Bustard. Both of us found it particularly hard to part, just as we had at last gained the initiative ourselves. However, Wöhler had been appointed Chief of Staff of Central Army Group, and I obviously could not put anything in the way of his advancement. Wöhler's successor was General Schulz, who was also to prove a sound counsellor and friend. He was an inestimable help to me in the most difficult phases of the 1943 winter campaign and throughout the time we were fighting to save 6th Army. Apart from being a man of great personal courage, he had nerves of steel and a special awareness of the privations and needs of the fighting troops, as well as a most equable nature. Already, as Chief of Staff of a corps, he had won the Knight's Cross in a most difficult situation. Later, as a corps commander in Southern Army Group, he was to prove a tower of strength. On 8th May, 11th Army moved off on Operation Bustard. 30 Corps was able to cross the anti-tank obstacle and penetrate the enemy's most forward positions, and the assault boat expedition, by virtue of the surprise it achieved, had rendered considerable assistance to our right wing in its advance along the coast. Nevertheless, it was no easy battle. The ground gained on the far side of the ditch was not sufficient for the armoured division to be moved over, and the subsequent attack by 42 Corps only progressed with difficulty. Nevertheless, we had already engaged 10 enemy divisions and shattered the enemy's southern wing, and there was no indication that his reserves had moved away from the northern wing. It was not possible to bring up and deploy 22 Panzer Division until 9th of May, and before swinging north it had to fight off a strong tank attack. Then rain set in and continued all night, making it well nigh impossible for the Luftwaffe's close support units to cooperate, or for the tanks to make any headway on the morning of 10th May. Though the weather cleared in the afternoon, the 24-hour time lag was liable to be our undoing in an operation so dependent on speed of movement. It was consoling to know that before the rain started, Brigade Group Grodek had been able to move swiftly east, a fact which subsequently enabled it to frustrate every enemy attempt to form a front further back. Evidently, the enemy had not anticipated such a bold drive into the depths of his communications zone. Unluckily, the valiant brigade commander, Colonel V's Grodek, was severely wounded in the course of the operation and died soon afterwards. From 11th May onwards, the operations proceeded without any serious hold-up. 22 Panzer Division got through to the coast in the north, bottling up some 8 enemy divisions as it went, and the army was able to give the order for the pursuit to start. The troops, Romanians included, strained every nerve to carry it through successfully, and by 16th May, Kerch had fallen to 170 Division and 213 Regiment. Even then, a great deal more heavy fighting was needed to mop up the enemy remnants which had trickled back to the east coast. Before the attack was launched, I had once again moved into a command post close behind the front, and now I was out all day long visiting divisional staffs and the front-line troops. For a soldier, there was something unforgettable about this tempestuous chase. All the roads were littered with enemy vehicles, tanks and guns, and one kept passing long processions of prisoners. The view from a hill near Kerch, where I had a rendezvous with General Richthofen, was quite breathtaking. Down below us, bathed in glorious sunshine, lay the Straits of Kerch, the goal we had dreamt of for so long. From the beach in front of us, which was crammed with Soviet vehicles of every possible description, enemy motor torpedo boats made repeated attempts to pick up Soviet personnel, but they were driven off every time by our own gunfire. In order to spare our infantry any further sacrifices and bring about the surrender of the enemy elements, still fighting back desperately along the coast itself, we had a mass artillery barrage laid down on these last pockets of resistance. By 18th May, the Battle of the Kerch Peninsula was over. Only small groups of the enemy continued to hold out in subterranean caves around Kerch for weeks to come under the pressure of a few fanatical commissars. According to the returns sent in, some 170,000 prisoners, 1,133 guns and 258 tanks had fallen into our hands. 5 German infantry divisions and 1 armoured, together with 2 Romanian infantry divisions and 1 cavalry brigade, had annihilated 2 whole Soviet armies of 26 formations. Only negligible elements of the enemy had escaped across the Straits of Kerch to the Taman Peninsula. A true battle of annihilation had been fought to a victorious finish. 11th Army still faced the hardest task of all, the conquest of Sevastopol. I had already apprised Hitler of our intentions regarding the assault on the fortress during a visit to his headquarters in mid-April. It was the first time I had met him since submitting my views to him on the conduct of the offensive in the West in February 1940. Even at this second meeting, I had the impression that he was not only extremely well informed on every detail of the battles fought to date, but also thoroughly appreciated the operational arguments expounded to him. He listened attentively to what I had to say, and fully agreed with 11th Army's view on the way to conduct both the Kerch offensive and the assault on Sevastopol. He made not the least effort to interfere in our plans, or, as was so often the case later on, to ramble off into endless recitations of production figures. One vital question was not discussed on that occasion, however, whether, in view of the offensive planned in the Ukraine, it was right to commit the whole of 11th Army to an attack on the powerful Sevastopol fortress for a period that could not be predetermined with any real certainty, particularly now that the victory on the Kerch Peninsula had removed the threat in the Crimea. The settlement of this problem was clearly a matter for the Supreme Command, not for our own headquarters. Speaking for myself, I believed at the time, and still do today, that the decision to make 11th Army take Sevastopol first was the correct one. Had we continued merely to invest the fortress, a good 3 or 4 German divisions, plus the Romanian forces, in other words, half 11th Army, would have continued to be tied up in the Crimea. What was undoubtedly a mistake, however, was the Supreme Command's decision, after Sevastopol's timely fall, to withdraw 11th Army from the southern wing of the Eastern Front for use at Leningrad and for patching up gaps in the line. After the fall of Sevastopol, this army ought, as originally planned, to have been taken across the Straits of Kerch to the Kuban to intercept the enemy forces falling back on the Caucasus from the lower Don before Army Group A. Had the time factor not permitted this, it should at any rate have been taken into reserve behind the southern wing. The Stalingrad tragedy might then have been averted. Immediately after the Kerch operation, 11th Army began regrouping for the assault on Sevastopol. 42 Corps was made responsible for safeguarding the Kerch Peninsula and the south coast of the Crimea. The only German troops left to it for this purpose were those of 46 Infantry Division, in addition to which it had 7 Romanian Corps, comprising 10 and 19 Infantry Divisions, 4 Mountain Division, identical with the 4 Mountain Brigade mentioned earlier. The Romanians had changed the designation of these mountain brigades without in fact increasing their strength to that of a division, TRA and 8 Cavalry Brigade. All other forces were forthwith dispatched to Sevastopol. Teku Panzer Division had to be handed over to Southern Army Group. Author. There could be no shadow of doubt that the assault on the fortress would be even tougher than that of the previous December, the enemy having had half a year in which to tighten up his fortifications, bring his manpower up to strength and stock up with stores from across the sea. The strength of the Sevastopol fortress consisted less in up-to-date fortifications, though a certain number of these did exist, than in the extraordinary difficulty of the ground, which was dotted with innumerable smaller defence installations. These formed a thick network covering the entire area from the Belbek Valley to the Black Sea coast. The whole of the ground between the Belbek Valley and Severnaya Bay in particular constituted a strongly developed fortress belt. The Northern front ran south of the Belbek, though north of this too, the enemy had an extensive strong point around and northwards of the locality of Lyubimovka. The valley itself and the slopes rising away to the south were enfiladed by a 30.5 scimitars. Battery housed in a thoroughly up-to-date armoured emplacement, known to us as Maxim Gorky the Fee. The slopes themselves were covered by a thick net of fieldworks 1 mile deep, some of which were concreted. Behind these came a series of strongly built, mainly concreted strongpoints, which our troops had nicknamed Stalin, Volga, Siberia, Molotov, GPU, and Cheka, and which were mutually linked by a chain of dug-in positions. A final barrier to the northern shore of Severnaya Bay was formed by a defence zone of strongpoints, which included Donets, Don, Lenin, the fortified locality of Bartenyevka, the old North Fort and the coastal batteries on Battery Headland. Into the cliffs overlooking the bay, the Russians had driven chambers for storing supplies and ammunition. The eastern front branched off the northern one at a point about 1.25 miles east of the village of Belbek, the hinge between the two being protected by the precipitous Kamishli ravine. The northern part of this eastern front ran through a stretch of the dense undergrowth with which the steep spurs of the Weiler Mountains in this area are covered. In this undergrowth there were countless small pockets of resistance, some of them nestling in holes blown in the rock, which an attacker could hardly touch with his artillery. This wooded northern sector of the eastern front ended in the steep cliffs south and southeast of the locality of Gaetani. Though the woods petered out further south, the ground became increasingly difficult down towards the coast, where it resembled a range of rocky mountains. Access to the southern fortress zone on both sides of the highway leading from the south coast to Sevastopol was barred in the first instance by a series of steep, dome-shaped summits, which the Russians had converted into powerful strongpoints. Crimea veterans will remember such names as Sugarloaf, North Nose, Chapel Mount, and Ruin Hill. Then came the strongly defended village of Kamari, and finally the rocky massif northeast of the Bay of Balaclava. The enemy had been able to hold his own here when 105 Infantry Regiment achieved its bold capture of Balaclava Fort in autumn 1941. Penetration of this chain of fortified summits and cliffs was rendered all the more difficult by the fact that one hill always flanked the next. Behind this forward defence zone in the south, north of the road from Sevastopol, rose the massif of the Feyukini Heights, which was extended southwards to the coastal range by strongpoints like Eagle's Perch and the fortified village of Kardikovka. All these formed a sort of foreground to the strongest of the enemy's fortifications, which were established along the Zarpun Heights. The latter are a range of hills with steep eastern slopes, beginning at the cliffs of Inkerman and dominating the valley of the Chornaya down to the south of Gaetani. There they turn southwest to bar the road to Sevastopol, and finally link up with the sea through Windmill Hill, the western spur of the coastal range. The Zapun position, by virtue of its sharp drops and possibilities for mutual flanking fire, is extremely difficult for infantry to attack, and artillery observers up there command the entire fortress area as far as the eye can see. These heights, incidentally, were the line held by the Western powers during the Crimean War to cover the rear of their attack on Sevastopol against the Russians' idle relieving army. But even when he had taken this commanding position, the attacker's troubles were still not over. Ranged along the coast were the coastal batteries, including Maxim Gorky the Second in its armoured emplacement. There was also a wide semicircle of continuous defences round the city itself, beginning at Inkerman on Severnaya Bay and rejoining the latter by Streletskaya Bay. It was composed of an anti-tank ditch, a barbed wire obstacle and numerous pillboxes, and included the British Crimean War Cemetery southeast of Sevastopol, which the Russians had converted into a strong battery emplacement. Finally, there were a line of fortifications running hard along the periphery of the city, and also several traverses screening the peninsula of Chersones towards the east. The Russians have always been known for their skill in laying out and camouflaging field defences, and at Sevastopol they had the added advantage of holding a stretch of country which offered them excellent opportunities for flanking fire. The rocky nature of the ground, moreover, made it possible to keep the cover for guns and mortars so narrow that they could practically only be destroyed by direct hits. And since we were dealing with Russians, it was a matter of course that extensive minefields had been laid not only along the front of the various defence zones, but also right inside them. When considering how the assault on the fortress area should be conducted, 11th Army arrived at essentially the same conclusions as it had done the previous winter. We could not entertain any idea of using the central portion of the siege front for a decisive operation, because artillery and air support, our two main trumps, could never become entirely effective in the wooded area there, and our losses would be far too great. We thus had no choice but to attack once again from the north and northeast and in the south of the eastern sector. This time, too, at least to begin with, The main punch was to be delivered in the north, for although the enemy fortifications were undoubtedly stronger and more numerous in the northern area of the fortress above Severnaya Bay than in its southern part, the going there was far easier. Above all, the artillery and Luftwaffe could be used to infinitely greater effect in the north than in the hilly country of the southern sector. Of course, there still had to be an attack in the south as well. For one thing, it was important to split the enemy's defence by attacking from several sides at once. For another, he must be expected to hold out in the city itself and on the Chersonis headland, even after losing the fortified area north of Severnaya Bay. We had to remember that the task facing us at Sevastopol involved not only taking a fortress, but also fighting an army which was certainly our match numerically, even if it were inferior in material. According to the data available to 11th Army, the order of battle of the troops in the fortress at that time was as follows: HQ Coast Army, General Petrov, 2, 25, 95, 172, 345, 386 and 388 Rifle Divisions, 40 Dismounted Cavalry Division, and 7, 8 and 79 Marine Brigades. The badly battered Coast Army divisions, which had escaped into the fortress earlier on, were now believed to be fully up to strength again. Author. The factor that had primarily guided our assault tactics in the winter, the need to gain command of the harbour at the earliest possible date, was no less important, however. As long as 11th Army had 8 air corps in support, the enemy would no longer be at liberty to supply himself by sea. Such were the considerations on which 11th Army based its plan for Sturgeon, the code name of the operation. We intended to attack on the northern front and the southern part of the eastern front, while keeping the enemy pinned down in the central sector from Mackenzie to Verkchogun. In the north, the first objectives were the northern shore of Severnaya Bay and the heights around Gaetani. In the south, the capture of the dominating heights of the Zapun position on both sides of the roads, leading from the south coast and Balaclava to Sevastopol. The attack in the north was to be carried out by 54 Corps, comprising 22, 24, 50 and 132 infantry divisions, commanded by Generals Wolfe, Baron versus Tetau, Schmidt and Lindemann, and a reinforced 213 infantry regiment. The Corps' orders were to keep its forces rigidly concentrated in the main direction of assault on the high ground north of the eastern part of Severnaya Bay. All parts of the fortified zone bypassed in the first instance were to be pinned down with a view to taking as many of them as possible from the rear later on. The left wing of the corps was to gain possession of the heights of Gaetani and the ground to the southeast of the latter in order to clear the way for the Romanian Mountain Corps' subsequent advance further south. The attack in the south was to be directed by HQ 30 Corps, with 72 and 170 infantry divisions and 28 Light Division under command. Commanded by Generals Müller-Gebhard, Sander and Sinhuber respectively. Author. Its first job was to gain the starting line and artillery observation posts for the advance towards the Zapun Heights. To achieve this, it had to capture the enemy's foremost defence zone, based on the strong points of North Nose, Chapel Mount, Ruin Hill, Cammery and High Cliff south of Cammery, and to eliminate flanking fire from the rocky heights east of Balaclava in the south. To solve this problem, 72 Infantry Division was to advance along both sides of the highway to Sevastopol, while 28 Light Division, in accordance with its specialised role, had to capture the most northerly summits of the range of mountains east of Balaclava Bay. 170 Division was kept in reserve for the time being. Because of the peculiarly rugged terrain in this sector, the tasks in question could only be solved by carefully prepared local attacks. Sandwiched between the two big assault groups, the Romanian Mountain Corps was initially responsible for pinning down the enemy on its own front. In particular, 18 Romanian Division was to carry out local attacks and an artillery bombardment to protect 54 Corps' left wing against enemy flanking action from the south. Further south, one Romanian Mountain Division was to support 30 Corps' northern wing by capturing the Sugarloaf. In making its artillery preparations for the attack, 11th Army dispensed with the intensive barrage so popular with our opponents. In view of the peculiar nature of the ground and the endless number of enemy positions, this could not be expected to have any decisive effect, nor should we have enough ammunition available. Instead, the preparations would start 5 days before the infantry assault, beginning with an air attack and all-out artillery strafe against supply lines and points where enemy reserves were known to be concentrated. In the 5 days that followed, our gunners were to beat down the enemy artillery by steady observed fire and soften up positions in the enemy's foremost defence zone. Throughout this period, 8 Air Corps would be making continual attacks on the city, harbour, supply installations and airfields. And now, a word about our artillery strength. 11th Army had naturally called in every gun within reach for the attack, and OKH had made available the heaviest pieces available. In all, 54 Corps, Artillery Commander General Zukertort, had at its disposal 56 heavy and medium batteries, 41 light and 18 mortar batteries, in addition to 2 battalions of assault guns. This made a total of 121 batteries, supported by 2 observation battalions. The heavy siege artillery included batteries of cannon up to a calibre of 19 cm, as well as independent howitzer and heavy howitzer batteries with calibres of 30.5, 35 and 42 cm. Furthermore, there were 2 special 60 cm guns and the celebrated 80 cm Big Dora. This monster had originally been designed for bombarding the most formidable section of the Maginot Line, but had not been finished in time. It was a miracle of technical achievement. The barrel must have been 90 feet long, and the carriage as high as a 2-story house. 60 trains had been required to bring it into position along a railway specially laid for the purpose. 2 anti-aircraft regiments had to be constantly in attendance. Undoubtedly, the effectiveness of the cannon bore no real relation to all the effort and expense that had gone into making it. Nevertheless, one of its shells did destroy a big enemy ammunition dump buried 90 feet deep in the natural rock on the northern shore of Severnaya Bay. 30 Corps artillery was commanded by General Martinek, a particularly outstanding gunner officer who had previously held the same rank in the Austrian army. Unfortunately, he was later killed in the east as a corps commander. Altogether, the corps had 25 heavy and medium, 25 light, and 6 mortar batteries, as well as 1 assault gun and 2 observation battalions. Also assigned to it was 300 Panzer Regiment, whose tanks were remote-controlled and carried high explosive charges. The Romanian Mountain Corps had 12 medium and 22 light batteries with which to perform its holding task. A welcome addition to the assault artillery as a whole was provided by General Richthofen, commander of 8 Air Corps, who turned over a number of his anti-aircraft regiments for use in a ground role. At no other time on the German side in World War II can artillery ever have been more formidably massed, particularly as regards the high calibres used, than for the attack on Sevastopol. Yet how trifling this seems when compared with the masses of guns later considered indispensable by the Russians for a breakthrough in open country. At Sevastopol, the attacker had 208 batteries, excluding anti-aircraft, at his disposal over a 22-mile front. This meant an average of less than 10 batteries to every mile of front, though the ratio was obviously higher in the actual assault sectors. The Soviet offensives of 1945 were based on a ratio of 400 guns to every mile of assault front. A few days before the attack, I paid a brief visit to the south coast to take a closer look at 30 Corps' own preparations. Our command post down there was a charming little Moorish-style palace, perched on a steep cliff overhanging the Black Sea coast, and formerly the property of a Grand Duke. On the last day of my stay, I made a reconnaissance trip in our only naval vessel, an Italian E-boat, along the coast to a point off Balaclava. My object was to ascertain how much of the coastal road, up which the whole of the Corps' reinforcements and supplies must pass, was visible from the sea and liable to come under observed bombardment from that quarter. In the event, presumably out of respect for our Luftwaffe, the Soviet Black Sea Fleet ventured no such action. On the way back, a calamity occurred just outside Yalta. Without any warning, a hail of machine gun bullets and cannon shells began pumping into us from the sky. We were being strafed by 2 Soviet fighters which had swooped out of the sun, their sound having been drowned by the roar of our own powerful engines. In a matter of seconds, 7 of the 16 persons on board were dead or wounded, and the heat from the flames threatened to detonate the torpedoes slung alongside. The behaviour of the captain, a young Italian sub-lieutenant, was beyond all praise, and he showed immense presence of mind in the steps he took to save us and his ship. Disregarding the danger of mines, Peppo, my ADC, dived into the water and swam to the nearby shore, where, still stark naked, he stopped a passing truck. With this, he dashed into Yalta and got the help of a Croatian motorboat to tow us into harbour. It was a dismal journey. 1 Italian petty officer was dead and 3 sailors wounded. Captain V. Weddell, the port commandant of Yalta, had also been killed. But at my feet, severely wounded in the thigh, lay the truest comrade of all, my driver, Fritz Nagel. The Italian sub-lieutenant tore off his own shirt to use it as a makeshift bandage, but it was almost impossible to staunch the flow of blood from the artery. Fritz Nagel came from Karlsruhe and had been my driver since 1938. We had seen and lived through so very much together, and he had already been wounded at my side once before during our time with 56 Panzer Corps. Throughout the years he had been a devoted comrade, and in time had become a real friend to me. He had fine, frank brown eyes, and not a trace of servility in his make-up. Sportsmanlike and thoroughly decent by nature, he was a keen, cheerful soldier who had won the hearts of comrades and superiors alike. As soon as we touched land, I took him straight to the field hospital. An operation was attempted, but he had already lost too much blood, and the same night his young light went out. We buried him alongside all our other German and Italian comrades in the Yalta cemetery high above the sea, perhaps one of the most lovely spots on the whole of that glorious coastline. I sent Fritz Nagel's parents a copy of the words I spoke at his graveside. But war waits for no man, not even for his thoughts. A few days later, 11th Army's tactical headquarters, reduced to a bare minimum of personnel, set up a command post on the Sevastopol front at Yukari Korales, a Tatar village nestling in a narrow valley among the cliffs. The Russians must have known that a command staff with its own signals section had moved in there, for every evening their duty pilot flew over in an old Rata, known to the troops as a sewing machine, to drop a stick of bombs, fortunately, without ever doing the slightest damage. On a cliff-top above the village, in the Cherkess-Kerman mountains, where the Goths had once built their stronghold, we had established an observation post, and on the evening of 6th of June we went up to watch the infantry assault go in along the entire front next morning. It was here, in a small dugout adjoined by an observation trench equipped with stereo telescopes, that the Chief of Staff, the heads of the operations and intelligence branches, Peppo and I spent the still hours of the night before the storm. Once again it was Peppo who introduced a cheerful note into an otherwise pensive evening. It had been suggested that I should issue an order of the day to the troops pointing out the importance of the impending battle. Generally speaking, I am not in favour of exhortations of this kind. Quite apart from the fact that they seldom get past the battalion orderly rooms, our troops did not need reminding what was at stake. Since it was the usual thing to do on such occasions, however, I wrote out a few words on a sheet of paper and handed it to Peppo for transmission to all Corps headquarters. Shortly afterwards he returned to report, "Herr General Oberst, I've passed on the blurb." It was a cheeky thing to say, but he was only expressing the ordinary soldier's view of such proclamations, and we all had a good laugh over it. On the morning of 7th June, as dawn turned the eastern sky to gold and swept the shadows from the valleys, our artillery opened up in its full fury by way of a prelude to the infantry assault. Simultaneously, the squadrons of the Luftwaffe hurtled down onto their allotted targets. The scene before us was indescribable, since it was unique in modern warfare for the leader of an army to command a view of his entire battlefield. To the northwest, the eye could range from the woodlands that hid the fierce battles of 54 Corps' left wing, from view right over to the heights south of the Belbek Valley, for which we were to fight so bitterly. Looking due west, one could see the heights of Gaitani, and behind them, in the far distance, the shimmer of Severnaya Bay, where it joined the Black Sea. Even the spurs of the Chersones Peninsula, on which we were to find vestiges of Hellenic culture, were visible in clear weather. To the southwest there towered the menacing heights of Zapun and the rugged cliffs of the coastal range. At night, within the wide circumference of the fortress, one saw the flashes of enemy gunfire, and by day the clouds of rock and dust cast up by the bursts of our heavy shells and the bombs dropped by German aircraft. It was indeed a fantastic setting for such a gigantic spectacle. At Sevastopol there was something more than an attacking army confronted by an adversary who was at least its numerical equal, something more than artillery and aircraft of the most modern design pounding away at fortifications embedded in steel, concrete and granite. Sevastopol was also the spirit of the German soldier. All his courage, initiative and self-sacrifice contending with the dogged resistance of an opponent whose natural elements were the advantage of terrain and the tenacity and steadfastness of the Russian soldier reinforced by the iron compulsion of the Soviet system. It is impossible to depict this struggle, which was to go on for a round month in the most scorching heat, even early morning temperatures being as much as 106 degrees, in terms that would do justice to the feat of either attacker or defender. What our troops achieved in this battle would be worthy of an epic, but there is only space here for a brief account of a contest that must be almost unparalleled in its severity. On its right wing, 54 Corps had directed 132 Division to launch a frontal attack across the Belbek Valley towards the commanding heights to the south of it, leaving out the enemy bridgehead of Lubyamovka. To the left of it, 22 Infantry Division had the task of opening the way across the valley for 132 Division by thrusting south of the Belbek from the east over the Kamishli Gully. To the left of that, the 50th Infantry Division, attacking through the locality of Kamishli, was to join this thrust in a southwesterly direction. On the extreme left wing of the corps, in the mountainous woodlands, the 24th Infantry Division was to work its way forward towards the heights of Gaitani, its left flank being covered by the 18th Romanian Division. As a result of overwhelming support by the powerful assault artillery and the incessant attacks of the 8th Air Corps, it was possible to cross the Kamishli Gully and Belbek Valley on the first day and gain a footing on the commanding heights south of the latter. Down in the south, 30 Corps' first job was to gain possession of the jumping-off positions for its own follow-up attack on both sides of the highway to Sevastopol, which was not to be launched until some days later. The second phase of the offensive, lasting up to June 17th, was marked on both fronts by a bitter struggle for every foot of ground, every pillbox and every trench. Time and again the Russians tried to win back what they had lost by launching violent counterattacks. In their big strong points, and in the smaller pillboxes too, they often fought till the last man and the last round. While the main burden of these battles was borne by the infantry and engineers, the advanced observation posts of our artillery still deserve special mention, since it was chiefly they who had to direct the fire which made it possible to take individual strong points and pillboxes. They, together with the assault guns, were the infantry's best helpmates. On June 13th, the valiant 16th Infantry Regiment of 22nd Division, led by Colonel Choltitz, succeeded in taking Fort Stalin, before which its attack had come to a standstill the previous winter. The spirit of our infantry was typified by one wounded man of this regiment, who, pointing to his smashed arm and bandaged head, was heard to cry, "I can take this lot now we've got the Stalin." By June 17th, it had been possible, though at the cost of heavy losses, to drive a deep wedge into the fortified zone in the north. The positions of the second defence line, Cheka, GPU, Siberia, and Volga, were in our hands. By the same date, 30 Corps was likewise able to drive a wedge into the advanced defence zones in front of the Zapun positions. In the course of heavy fighting, the fortified strongpoints of North Nose, Chapel Mount and Ruin Hill fell to 72 Division, while 170 Division took Cammery. To the north of the Corps, after a series of fruitless charges, 1st Romanian Mountain Division finally won the Sugarloaf. 28 Light Division, on the other hand, was advancing only very slowly over the rugged cliffs of the coastal range, Rose Hill and Vermilion Bay and Two, since the only mode of action to adopt in that maze of clefts and chasms was to leapfrog raiding parties from one point to the next, a process which entailed considerable losses. Despite the price we had paid for these successes, however, the outcome of the offensive seemed to be very much in the balance for the next few days. The endurance of our own troops was visibly running out. In the case of 54 Corps, it was found necessary to take 132 Division temporarily out of the line in order to exchange its sorely tried regiments for those of 46 Division in the Kerch Peninsula. Its place was taken by 24 Division, which had to be released from the left wing of the Corps for this purpose. At the very same time, 11th Army found itself under pressure from OKH to release 8 Air Corps for the Ukraine offensive unless any prospect could be offered of Sevastopol's early fall. We, for our own part, insisted that the attack must at all costs go on until final success was achieved, which in turn depended on the continued presence of 8 Air Corps. In the end, our view prevailed. Yet who at that time, faced with the dwindling strength of our infantry, could have guaranteed the early fall of the fortress? Realizing that the strength of our own troops might give out prematurely, 11th Army asked to be supplied with 3 extra infantry regiments, a request which OKH duly approved. They were at least to arrive in time for the final phase of the struggle. In the existing situation, it was found expedient in the case of both assaulting corps to take advantage of an attacker's ability to switch the direction or main effort of his assault as he pleases, and thereby to take the enemy by surprise. 54. Corps turned west, committing 213 Infantry Regiment and 24 Division to battle as it did so. 213 Regiment, led by Colonel Hitzfeld, took the armour-plated battery Maxim Gorky Dafant, one of whose guns had already been put out of action by a direct hit from a siege battery. The other was demolished by our engineers, who had succeeded in getting onto the top of it. However, the garrison of the fort, which went several stories deep, did not surrender until our engineers had blown their way in through the turrets at ground level. In the course of one attempted breakout, the commissar in command was killed, whereupon his men surrendered with the name of Christ trembling on their lips. After that, 24th Division was able, by June 21st, to clear the rest of the northern sector along the west coast, as far as the fortifications guarding the entrance to Severnaya Bay. In the case of 30 Corps, too, a surprise alteration in the focal point of the attack brought about an important success by June 17th. The Corps resolved to halt the advance across the northern chain of the coastal range east of Balaclava, and to concentrate its forces on and immediately south of the main road for a surprise thrust. There was only artillery to counteract any flank action from the direction of the coastal range. 72 Division duly succeeded in overrunning the enemy's positions south of the road, and its reconnaissance battalion, led by Major Bark, boldly exploited this initial gain by pushing straight through the floundering enemy as far as Eagle's Perch in front of the Zapun line. In the early morning of 18th of June, the battalion managed to take the strongly defended Eagle position, and to remain in possession there until the division could move reinforcements up. This having been achieved, it was possible to extend our penetration of the enemy defence system northwards. In the subsequent and third phase, success was again achieved by sudden shifts in the focal point of the attack, particularly on the part of the artillery. In the north, this meant the full attainment of the first objective, Severnaya Bay, and in the south possession of our jumping-off positions for the assault on the Zapun line. In the northern sector, the whole fire of the artillery was concentrated to permit 24 Division to take the peninsular forts dominating the entrance to Severnaya Bay. The most formidable of these was the antiquated but still powerful strongpoint known as North Fort. 22 Division gained control along its whole front of the cliffs overlooking Severnaya Bay. There was extremely hard fighting for the railway tunnel on the boundary between 22 and 50 divisions, out of which the enemy launched a strong counterattack with a brigade that had recently arrived by cruiser. The tunnel was finally captured by shelling its entrance. Not only hundreds of troops came out, but an even greater number of civilians, including women and children. Particular difficulty was experienced in winkling the enemy out of his last hideouts on the northern shore of the bay, where deep galleries for storing supplies and ammunition had been driven into the sheer wall of rock. These had been equipped for defence by the addition of steel doors. Since the occupants, under pressure from their commissars, showed no sign of surrendering, we had to try to blow the doors open. As our engineers approached the first of them, there was an explosion inside the casemate, and a large slab of cliff came tumbling down, burying not only the enemy within, but also our own squad of engineers. The commissar in command had blown the casemate and its occupants sky high. In the end, a second lieutenant from an assault battery, who had brought up his gun along the coastal road regardless of enemy shelling from the southern shore, managed to force the other casemates to open up after he had fired on their embrasures at point-blank range. Crowds of completely worn-out soldiers and civilians emerged, their commissars having committed suicide. Thirdly, 50 Division, which had some hard fighting to do in the thicket-covered country of its own sector, was able to reach the eastern end of Severnaya Bay and gain possession of the heights of Gaetani dominating the mouth of the Chornaya Valley. To the left of it, the right wing of the Romanian Mountain Corps was fighting its way forward through wooded country over the hills southeast of Gaetani. General Lascar, who later went into captivity at Stalingrad, was the life and soul of this advance. 30 Corps too made gains by sudden changes in the direction of its attack. Taking advantage of the capture of Eagle's Perch by 72 Division, it swung 170 Division round from the south to attack the Fedyukini Massif. The enemy, whose eyes were turned east and who was probably already expecting an attack on the Zapun Heights themselves, was taken completely by surprise, and it was possible to take the Massif relatively quickly. This secured a firm base for the decisive assault on the Zapun line. During the same few days, some progress was also made by the left wing of the Romanian Mountain Corps, one mountain division. 11th Army thus found itself in possession of almost the whole outer belt of the fortress by the morning of 26th June. The enemy had been thrown back into the inner fortified zone, whose northern front was formed by the precipitous rock face of Severnaya Bay's southern shore, and whose eastern front ran from the heights of Inkerman along the Zapun range to the cliffs around Balaclava. 11th Army now had to decide how to break open this inner ring of fortifications. It was taken for granted that the enemy in Sevastopol would continue to resist as bitterly as before, particularly as none of the statements issued by his immediate superiors, Crimean Front Headquarters, encouraged any hope of an evacuation. On the other hand, the fact had to be faced that though the enemy's reserves might be largely expended, the offensive capacity of the German regiments was also virtually at an end. In recent weeks, I had spent all my mornings and afternoons visiting corps staffs, artillery commanders, divisions, regiments, battalions, and gunner observation posts. I was only too well aware of the state of our units. The regiments had dwindled away to a few hundred men each, and I remember one company being pulled out of the line with a strength of 1 officer and 8 men. How, then, were we going to finish off the battle for Sevastopol, now that 54 Corps had Severnaya Bay before it, and 30 Corps was facing the difficult assault on the Zapun Heights? The ideal solution at this point would have been to switch the weight of the entire offensive to 30 Corps on the southern wing. In practice, however, this was just not possible. Moving the divisions alone was bound to take several days, and in this time the enemy would have an opportunity to recover his strength. In the frontal area, the two sectors were linked by only one narrow road, which we had taken immense trouble to build through the mountains the previous winter. In any case, it could not bear the weight of the heavy artillery, and the task of moving that quantity of guns round by way of Yalta and stocking them with ammunition when they reached the southern sector would have taken weeks to complete. An additional factor to bear in mind was the Supreme Command's intention of withdrawing 8 Air Corps from the Crimea at an early date. Immediately after 22 Division reached Severnaya Bay, I had been down to visit its regiments in order to obtain a general view of the situation from an observation post on the northern shore. Before me lay a stretch of water between half a mile and 1,000 yards wide, where whole fleets had once lain at anchor. On the far side, to the right, was the city of Sevastopol, and straight ahead a wall of cliff honeycombed with enemy positions. It occurred to me that from here, in other words from the flank, one should be able to unhinge the Zapun fortifications, for the last direction from which the enemy seemed likely to expect an attack was across Severnaya Bay. When I first discussed this plan of mine with 54 Corps and a number of subordinate commanders, there was a great deal of head-shaking and scepticism. How, they asked, could assault boats get across that broad stretch of bay in the face of the formidable array of guns and fortifications overlooking the southern shore? How, for that matter, were the assault boats even to be got to the shore and loaded with troops, when the sole access to the water was down 1 or 2 steep ravines, which could obviously be kept under fire by the enemy on the southern coast? For the very reason that it appeared impossible, however, an attack across Severnaya Bay would take the enemy unawares, and might well be the key to success. Despite all the objections raised, therefore, I stuck to my plan, hard though it was to order such a hazardous undertaking when one's own position prevented one from taking part. Once the decision had been taken, everyone involved set about its execution with the utmost energy. In this connection, a special word of appreciation is due to the engineers, who had already given an excellent account of themselves alongside the infantry in the fighting for the pillbox positions. The general offensive against the inner fortress area, 54 Corps crossing Severnaya Bay and 30 Corps assaulting the Zapun Heights, was due to start early on the morning of 29th June. Already on 28th June 50th, Division had succeeded in crossing the lower course of the Chornaya and taken the Inkerman. This was the scene of a tragedy that shows with what fanaticism the Bolsheviks fought. High above the Inkerman towered a sheer wall of cliff extending far away to the south. Inside it were enormous chambers which had served as cellarage for the Crimean champagne factories. Alongside the large stocks of wine, the Bolsheviks had dumped ammunition, but now they were also using the chambers to accommodate thousands of wounded and refugees. Just as our troops were entering the Inkerman, the whole cliff behind it shuddered under the impact of a tremendous detonation, and the Kofut wall of rock fell in over a length of some 900 yards, burying thousands of people beneath it. Though the act of a few fanatical commissars, it was a measure of the contempt for human life which had become a principle of this Asiatic power. During those midnight hours of 28th or 29th June in which the preparations for the crossing of Severnaya Bay were being made, a tremendous tension gripped everyone connected with the operation. In order to blanket all noise from the northern shore, 8 Air Corps kept up an incessant air raid on the city. The whole of the artillery stood by to begin a murderous bombardment of the cliff tops on the southern shore the very moment any fire from there showed that the enemy had perceived what we were about. But everything remained quiet on the other side, and the difficult job of launching and loading the assault boats went off without a hitch. At 1 o'clock, the first wave from 22 and 24 divisions pushed off and headed for the opposite shore. The crossing, which obviously took the enemy absolutely by surprise, turned out a complete success, for by the time the enemy defences on the cliffside went into action, our sturdy grenadiers had gained a firm footing on the shore below. Any enemy weapons showing themselves from now on were quickly knocked out by our troops as they scaled the cliffs to the plateau above. With that, the dreaded Zapun position was unhinged from the flank. At first light, however, our troops had also gone into action against the front of this position. On the left wing of 54 Corps, 50 Division and the newly committed 132 Division, now composed of the infantry regiments of 46th Division, moved off from positions around and to the south of Gaetani to assault the heights between the Inkerman and a point to the south of it. The attack received supporting flank fire from the artillery on the north shore of Severnaya Bay and was joined by the right wing of the Romanian Mountain Corps. 30 Corps likewise began its decisive push towards the Zapun line at daybreak, supported by the long-range batteries of 54 Corps and massed sorties by 8 Air Corps. While using its artillery to create the illusion that an attack on a broad front was pending, 30 Corps had assembled 170 Division as a task force in an extremely small area by the Fedjukini Heights, and the latter, supported by assault guns, 300 Panzer Battalion, and the direct fire of an anti-aircraft regiment, soon reached the high ground on both sides of the highway to Sevastopol. Taking advantage of the enemy's confusion, the division forthwith exploited far enough north, west and south for the Corps to move its other divisions up to the crest. After the successful crossing of the bay, the fall of the heights of Inkerman and the penetration of the Zapun positions by 30 Corps, the fate of the Sevastopol fortress was sealed. What now followed was a last desperate struggle that could neither stave off the defending army's utter defeat nor possibly benefit the Soviets as regards the overall operational situation. It would even have been superfluous from the viewpoint of military honour, for goodness knows the Russian soldier had fought bravely enough. But the political system demanded that the futile struggle should go on. Now that they had captured the cliffs on the south shore of the bay, the divisions of 54 Corps which had carried out the crossing were already inside the wide outer ring of positions which encompassed the city. So while elements of the Corps mopped up this ring in a southerly direction, the main body was able to turn west and deal with the peripheral fortifications and the city itself. With the fall of the famous Fort Malakoff, that bulwark which had cost so much blood in the Crimean War, the Corps was into the defences of Sevastopol proper. Meanwhile, before 29th of June was out, the 2 rear divisions of 30 Corps, which had had the task of simulating a broad frontal attack, 28 Light Division and 72 Division, were pushed smartly through behind 170 Division. Once they had reached the Zapun positions already taken by the latter, they were made to fan out to capture the Chersonis Peninsula. 28. Light Division broke through the outer ring of fortifications southeast of Sevastopol by taking the English cemetery. The Russians had developed this into a main strong point of their outer ring of fortifications, and the marble monuments once erected to British soldiers were now in ruins. The new dead of this battle were lying over graves torn open by shelling. Then the division thrust south of the city to take it from the west in case it should be defended, or alternatively to head off an enemy breakout. 170 Division's goal was the lighthouse on the extreme western tip of the Chersonis Peninsula, the spot from which Iphigenia may have gazed, soulfully seeking the Grecian land. On 72nd Division devolved the task of thrusting along the south coast. Rolling up the Zapun positions in a southward direction, it first took the dominant Windmill Hill and thereby secured the main road to Sevastopol for the use of the Corps. It was followed by 4 Romanian Mountain Division, which set about flushing the defence system round Balaclava from the rear, taking 10,000 prisoners in the process. After our experience of Soviet methods to date, we were bound to assume that the enemy would make a last stand behind Sevastopol's perimeter defences and finally in the city itself. An order from Stalin had been repeatedly wirelessed to the defenders to hold out to the last man and the last round, and we knew that every member of the civil population capable of bearing arms had been mustered. Our headquarters would have been neglectful of its duty to the soldiers of 11th Army had it failed to take account of this possibility. A battle within the city would cause more heavy losses to the attacker. In order to obviate them, we directed the artillery and 8 Air Corps to go into action once more before the divisions resumed their assault. The enemy was to be shown that he could not expect to extract a further toll of blood from us in house-to-house fighting. And so 1st July began with a massed bombardment of the perimeter fortifications and the enemy's strongpoints in the interior of the city. Before long, our reconnaissance aircraft reported that no further serious resistance need be anticipated. The shelling was stopped and the divisions moved in. It seemed probable that the enemy had pulled the bulk of his forces out to the west the previous night. But the struggle was still not over. Although the Soviet Coast Army had given up the city, it had only done so in order to offer further resistance from behind the defences which sealed off the Chersonese peninsula, either in pursuance of Stalin's backs-to-the-wall order, or else in the hope of still getting part of the army evacuated by Red Fleet vessels at night from the deep inlets west of Sevastopol. As it turned out, only very few of the top commanders and commissars were fetched away by motor torpedo boat, one of them being the army commander, General Petrov. When his successor tried to escape in the same way, he was intercepted by our Italian E-boat. Thus, the final battles on the Chersonese peninsula lasted up till 4th of July. While 72 Division captured the armour-plated fort of Maxim Gorky II, which was defended by several thousand men, the other divisions gradually pushed the enemy back towards the extreme tip of the peninsula. The Russians made repeated attempts to break through to the east by night, presumably in the hope of joining up with the partisans in the Yaila Mountains. Whole masses of them rushed at our lines, their arms linked to prevent anyone from hanging back. At their head, urging them on, there were often women and girls of the communist youth, themselves bearing arms. Inevitably, the losses which sallies of this kind entailed were extraordinarily high. In the end, the remnants of the Coast Army sought refuge in big caverns on the shore of the Chersonese peninsula, where they waited in vain to be evacuated. When they surrendered on 4th of July, 30,000 men emerged from this small tip of land alone. In all, the number of prisoners taken in the fortress was over 90,000, and the enemy's losses in killed amounted to many times our own. The amount of booty captured was so vast that it could not immediately be calculated. A naturally strong fortress, reinforced and consolidated in every conceivable way and defended by a whole army, had fallen. The army was annihilated and the entire Crimea now in German hands. At just the right time from the operational point of view, 11th Army had become free for use in the big German offensive on the southern wing of the Eastern Front. I had spent the evening of 1st July with my immediate staff in our command post, a little Tatar dwelling in Yukari Corrales. The Soviet duty pilot, whose habit it had been to drop a few bombs in our valley around sundown, had not shown up. Our thoughts went back to the battles of recent months and the comrades who were no longer with us. And then, over the radio, came a triumphal fanfare heralding the special communiqué on the fall of Sevastopol. Shortly afterwards the following message came over the teleprinter. To the Commander-in-Chief of the Crimean Army, Colonel General V. Manstein, in grateful appreciation of your exceptionally meritorious services in the victorious battles of the Crimea, culminating in the annihilation of the enemy at Kerch and the conquest of the mighty fortress of Sevastopol, I hereby promote you Field Marshal. By your promotion and the creation of a commemorative shield to be worn by all ranks who took part in the Crimean campaign, I pay tribute before the whole German people to the heroic achievements of the troops fighting under your command. Divisions of 11th Army were recovering from the hardships of the recent fighting, and I was on leave in Romania. The various formation staffs were to work out plans for a crossing of the Straits of Kerch, preparatory to the army's joining in the big offensive, which had meanwhile been launched on the German southern wing. Throughout my leave I was kept posted on the preparations by the visits of my Chief of Operations, Colonel Buser. Unfortunately, all this planning proved quite fruitless. Hitler, as usual, was chasing after too many objectives at once, overrating the initial successes of the offensive. He gave up his original intention of including 11th Army in the operations. Upon returning to the Crimea on August 12th, I was disturbed to find a new directive from the Supreme Command awaiting me. The plan to take the army across the straits had been dropped and replaced by an operation involving only HQ 42 Corps, 46 Division, and certain Romanian forces. 11th Army itself was earmarked for the capture of Leningrad, for which the artillery used in the assault on Sevastopol was already en route. Unfortunately, 3 further divisions were detached from us. 50 Division was to remain in the Crimea. 22 Division, now converted back into an airborne division, was sent to Crete, where, though one of our best formations, it was to lie more or less idle for the rest of the war. Finally, when we were already on the move, 72 Division was diverted to Central Army Group to deal with a local crisis there. Thus, all that ultimately remained of 11th Army's original order of battle were HQ's 54 and 30 Corps, 24, 132 and 170 infantry divisions and 28 light division. Irrespective of what the Supreme Command's motives may have been, this dismemberment of an army in which the same corps and divisions had worked together for so long was deplorable. Mutual acquaintanceship and the trust that comes from fighting hard battles together are factors of the utmost importance in war and should never be disregarded. But there was another aspect of even greater relevance. Could there be any justification for taking 11th Army away from the southern wing of the Eastern Front now that it was free in the Crimea and employing it on a task which was palpably less important, the conquest of Leningrad? On the German side, after all, the decisive results in that summer of 1942 were being sought in the south of the front. This was a task for which we could never be too strong, particularly as it was obvious even now that the duality of Hitler's objective, Stalingrad and the Caucasus, would split the offensive in 2 directions, and that the further east it went, the longer the northern flank of the spearhead must become. Subsequent events showed how much better it would have been to keep 11th Army on the southern wing, irrespective of whether it had been moved forward over the Straits of Kerch to stop the enemy from falling back on the Caucasus, or had initially followed up the attacking army groups as an operational reserve. When I broke my flight north to call at Hitler's headquarters and talk over my new commitments, I discussed this problem in detail with the Chief of the General Staff, Colonel General Halder. Halder made it quite clear that he completely disagreed with Hitler's proposal to try to take Leningrad in addition to conducting an offensive in the south, but said that Hitler had insisted on this and refused to relinquish the idea. However, when I asked if he thought it practicable to dispense entirely with 11th Army in the south, he told me that he did. I myself remained sceptical, without, of course, being able to refute the Chief of Staff's opinion in advance. On the same occasion, I was appalled to find how bad relations were between Hitler and his Chief of Staff. One of the points brought up at the daily conference was the local crisis which had developed in Central Army Group's sector in consequence of a limited Soviet offensive there. The same crisis, in fact, that had necessitated the detachment of our own 72 Division. When Hitler took this as an occasion for indulging in a tirade against the men fighting on the spot, Halder emphatically contradicted him, pointing out that the strength of the troops had long been overtaxed, and that the high loss of officers and NCOs in particular had been bound to have repercussions. Though couched in thoroughly objective language, Halder's strictures provoked an outburst of fury from Hitler. He questioned, in the most tactless terms, Halder's right to differ with him, declaring that as a frontline infantryman of World War I, he was an infinitely better judge of the matter than Halder, who had never been in this position. The whole scene was so undignified that I pointedly left the map table and remained away till Hitler calmed down and asked me to return. Afterwards, I felt compelled to mention the incident to the head of the personnel office, General Schmundt, who was also Hitler's chief military assistant. I told him it was quite impossible for the Commander-in-Chief and the Chief of Staff of the Army to be on terms like this, and that either Hitler must listen to his Chief of Staff and show him at least the respect that was his due, or Halder must take the only course remaining open to him. Unfortunately, nothing of the sort occurred until the break came 6 weeks later with Halder's dismissal. On August 27th, 11th Army Headquarters arrived on the Leningrad front to investigate the possibilities of an attack in 18th Army's sector and to settle on the plan for the assault on the city. It was intended that once this was done, we should take over that part of 18th Army's front which faced north, while the latter retained its eastern front on the Volkhov. The front earmarked for 11th Army was divided into three parts: the Neva sector from Lake Ladoga to the southeast of Leningrad, the actual assault front south of Leningrad, and the front containing the extensive bridgehead still held by the Soviets on the south shore of the Gulf of Finland around Oranienbaum. In addition to powerful assault artillery, part of which had been brought up from Sevastopol, there were to be over 13 divisions at the Army's disposal, including the Spanish Blue Division, one armoured and one mountain division, and an SS brigade. Of these forces, however, since the Neva and Oranienbaum fronts would be requiring 2 divisions each, only 9.5 would be left for the attack on Leningrad. This was none too big a force, considering that the enemy had an army there of 19 rifle divisions, 1 rifle brigade, 1 frontier guard brigade, and between 1 and 2 independent armoured brigades. In view of these relative strengths, it would naturally have been of tremendous assistance to us if the Finns, who had forces sealing off the Karelian Isthmus in the north of Leningrad, had participated in the offensive. However, when the question was put to the German liaison officer at Finnish headquarters, General Erfurth, it emerged that the Finnish High Command had declined to take part. The Finnish standpoint, according to the general, was that Finland had maintained ever since 1918 that her existence would never constitute a threat to Leningrad. This put any Finnish contribution to the offensive right out of the question. 11th Army thus found itself thrown entirely on its own resources for the execution of its mission. We were well aware that the success of the operation was somewhat problematical, and the fact that it need not have been necessary at all hardly made it any more palatable to us. In the summer of 1941, there had probably been a very good chance of taking Leningrad by a coup de main. Though in those early days Hitler himself regarded the early capture of the city as a main priority, the opportunity was missed for some reason or other. Later, Hitler thought he could starve Leningrad out. This the Soviets foiled by supplying the city over Lake Ladoga, in the summer by ship and in the winter by a railway line laid across the ice. What the Germans were left with today was a front from Lake Ladoga to the west of Oranienbaum, which was a steady drain on their resources. While its removal was certainly most desirable, the advisability of attacking the city just now, when an attempt was being made to force the issue in the south of the Eastern Front, was a debatable point. As Schiller once said, "What we omit from a single hour is lost to all eternity." Still, it was up to us to prepare as best we could for the attack we were called upon to make. To anyone reconnoitring along the front south of Leningrad, the city seemed to lie within clutching distance, although it enjoyed the protection of a whole net of fieldworks distributed in depth. One could pick out the big Kolpino works on the Neva, which were still turning out tanks. The Pulkovo shipyards on the Gulf of Finland were also visible. In the distance were the silhouettes of St. Isaac's Cathedral, the pointed tower of the Admiralty, and the fortress of Peter and Paul. In clear weather, it was also possible to see a battle cruiser on the Neva that had been disabled by gunfire. She was one of the 10,000-ton vessels we had sold to the Russians in 1940. I was sad to learn that several of the imperial residences I knew from 1931, the lovely Catherine Palace in Tsarsko Selo, the smaller palace in the same place where the last Tsar lived, and the delightful Peterhof on the Gulf of Finland, had fallen victims to the war. They had been set on fire by Soviet shelling. We realized from our reconnaissance that 11th Army must on no account become involved in any fighting inside the built-up areas of Leningrad, where its strength would be rapidly expended. As for Hitler's belief that the city could be compelled to surrender through terror raids by 8 Air Corps, we had no more faith in this than had Colonel General Verser Richthofen, the force's own experienced commander. It was our intention, therefore, to begin by breaking through the front south of Leningrad with maximum artillery and air support, but not to carry the advance any further than the southern perimeter of the city. Thereupon, 2 corps would turn east and quickly cross the Neva southeast of the city to destroy the enemy forces between there and Lake Ladoga, cut the supply route across the lake, and isolate Leningrad from the east. Thereafter it should be possible to bring about the rapid fall of the city, like Warsaw before it, without any heavy house-to-house fighting. Unfortunately, Schiller's dictum was soon to prove only too true. Quite naturally, the enemy had not failed to notice the German build-up in the Leningrad sector, and as early as 27th August he launched an attack against 11th Army's eastern front, forcing us to engage 170 Division just after its arrival. In the next few days it became clear that the Soviets were conducting a powerful relief offensive with the aim of forestalling our own attack. On the afternoon of 4th September, I received a telephone call from Hitler in person. He told me it was essential that I intervene on the Volkow front to prevent a disaster there. I was to assume command myself and restore the situation by offensive action. That very day, the enemy had effected a deep breakthrough over a wide stretch of 18th Army's slender front south of Lake Ladoga. Obviously, it was somewhat embarrassing for us to relieve 18th Army of command in its own sector just when a serious crisis had developed there. The headquarters staff had, quite understandably, been none too pleased to see us entrusted with so much as the attack on Leningrad. Even in the face of this open slight, however, it did everything possible to lighten our task in the absence of our own Q branch. Instead of the projected attack on Leningrad, a battle now developed south of Lake Ladoga. The enemy had succeeded in overrunning a 5-mile stretch of 18th Army's front north of the railway line from Leningrad to the east, and in penetrating some 8 miles to a point above Muga, through which the line passed. The first problem was to halt the enemy with what forces 11th Army had available. At the cost of some hard fighting, it was possible to do this in the next few days, and after assembling the rest of its divisions, which had arrived in the meantime, 11th Army was able to start its decisive counterattack. This was launched from the 2 still intact flanks in order to cut off the enemy spearhead at its route. The drive from the south was performed by 30 corps, comprising 24, 132 and 170 infantry divisions, and 3 mountain division. From the north came 26 corps, the formation originally responsible here, with 121 infantry division, 5 mountain division, and 28 light division under command. By 21st September, after heavy fighting, the enemy bulge had been tied off. In the next few days, vigorous attacks by fresh enemy forces from the east were beaten off as they tried to relieve the encircled enemy spearheads. A similar attempt by the Leningrad Army, attacking with 8 divisions across the Neva and from the front south of Leningrad, was equally unsuccessful. At the same time, however, we had to dispose of the strong enemy forces still trapped between Gaitolovo and Muga. As usual, despite the hopelessness of his position and the utter futility, even from the viewpoint of operations as a whole, of continuing the struggle, the enemy had no thought of giving in. On the contrary, he tried again and again to break out of the pocket. As the entire area was thickly wooded, we, incidentally, would never have attempted such a breakthrough in country of this sort. Any attempt on our part to get our infantry to grips with the enemy would have caused us excessive losses. Consequently, 11th Army brought over the greatest possible concentration of artillery from the Leningrad front in order to subject the pocket to a round-the-clock bombardment. In the space of only a few days, this shelling, supplemented by repeated attacks by the Luftwaffe, had turned the forest area into a pock-marked wilderness, relieved only by the stumps of what had recently been giant trees. The captured diary of a Soviet regimental commander later gave us some idea of what effect we had achieved. It also showed just how ruthless the commissars had been in forcing the troops in the pocket to prolong their resistance. By these methods, we were able to end the fighting in the pocket by 2nd October. The enemy, 2nd Shock Army, had thrown no fewer than 16 rifle divisions, 9 rifle brigades and 5 armoured brigades into the battle, and, out of these, 7 rifle divisions, 6 rifle brigades and 4 armoured brigades met their fate in the pocket. The remainder suffered extremely heavy losses in their fruitless attempts to batter a way through to the beleaguered force. 12,000 prisoners were taken, and over 300 guns, 500 mortars and 244 tanks were either captured or destroyed. The enemy's losses in dead many times exceeded the number of prisoners. While the task of restoring the position on 18th Army's eastern front was thereby fulfilled, our own division's casualties had also been heavy, and a considerable amount of the ammunition intended for the attack on Leningrad had been used up. In view of this, there could be no question of immediately going over to the offensive. Nonetheless, Hitler was at first unwilling to give up the idea of taking Leningrad, although he was not prepared to set more limited objectives. This, of course, would still not have achieved our object, which was to iron out the position on the Leningrad front once and for all, and 11th Army duly insisted that it could not undertake an operation against the city without an adequate rest and refit, let alone with insufficient forces. While these discussions dragged on and one plan superseded another, October passed by. It was more than frustrating to be stuck up here in the north when our offensive in the south of the front appeared to be petering out in the Caucasus and at the gates of Stalingrad. Not surprisingly, my ADC, Lieutenant Specht, once again felt the dissatisfaction which inevitably besets a young officer on a higher formation staff when there is nothing vital to occupy him. Peppo began tugging at the bit, and I, knowing how he felt, could not bring myself to deny him his wish. I sent him off to 170 Division, which was in action on the Neva, and in whose ranks he had already fought for a time in the Crimea. The poor lad crashed in a Fieseler Storch while on his way to join his regiment, and we buried him on 25th of October. His death was a sad blow to everyone, most of all to myself. Never again should we hear his clear voice and gay laugh. How I would miss this young comrade who had filled our many hours together with his merriment and been my companion on so many strenuous and dangerous trips, never once losing his brightness, self-confidence or drive. After my good comrade Nagel, he was the second of my immediate associates to be snatched away from us by the war in the East. Just before Specht's burial, I had to fly to the Supreme Headquarters to receive my Field Marshal's baton. What a thrill it would have given him to have gone with me. As had always been the case with me to date, Hitler went out of his way to be affable and spoke with warm appreciation of the way the troops of 11th Army had acquitted themselves in the Battle of Lake Ladoga. I took this opportunity to impress my views on him regarding the excessive demands being imposed on our infantry. With such high losses as we were bound to have in the East when fighting an enemy as tough as the Russians, it was vitally important that the infantry regiments should always be brought back up to strength with the minimum possible delay. But when replacements never arrived on time, and none had ever done so since the Russian campaign began, the infantry had to go into action far below their proper strength, with the inevitable result that the fighting troops became more and more worn down as time went on. Now we were aware that the Luftwaffe, on instructions from Hitler, was in the process of setting up 22 so-called Luftwaffe field divisions, for which it was able to spare 170,000 men. There was nothing surprising in this. Goering had always done things on an extravagant scale in his own domain, not only where funds and installations were concerned, but also in regard to manpower. In the same vein, the Luftwaffe had been established to take on operational commitments for which, as had since turned out, it was unable to find sufficient numbers either of air crews or machines. This is not the place to inquire why things should have been allowed to come to such a pass. The essential fact was that the Luftwaffe had some 170,000 men to spare, and could have spared them long ago, the dream of a strategic air war having ended, for all practical purposes, with the Battle of Britain. These 170,000 men were now to be concentrated in the Luftwaffe's own private units to fight a war on the ground. Considering what a wide choice had been open to the Luftwaffe in making its selections for these divisions, they were doubtless composed of first-class soldiers. Had they been drafted to army divisions as replacements in autumn 1941 to maintain the latter at their full fighting strength, the German army might well have been saved most of the emergencies of the winter of 1941-42. But to form these excellent troops into divisions within the framework of the Luftwaffe was sheer lunacy. Where were they to get the necessary close combat training and practice in working with other formations? Where were they to get the battle experience so vital in the East? And where was the Luftwaffe to find divisional, regimental, and battalion commanders? I covered all these aspects in detail during that talk with Hitler, and a little later set them out in a memorandum I drafted for his attention. He listened to my arguments attentively enough, but insisted that he had already given the matter his fullest consideration, and must stick to his decision. Shortly afterward, the then Chief of Operations of Central Army Group, a man who was always well informed on account of his friendship with Hitler's ADC, told me the reasons which Göring had given Hitler for wanting the Luftwaffe to set up its own divisions. Göring had claimed that he could not hand over his soldiers, reared in the spirit of National Socialism, to an army which still had chaplains and was led by officers steeped in the traditions of the Kaiser. He had already told his own people that the Luftwaffe must make sacrifices too, lest the army appear virtually to stand alone in this respect. Such were the arguments with which Göring had sold his scheme to Hitler. Our Leningrad mission as such was now coming to an end. During my visit to Vinitsa, Hitler said that my headquarters would probably be moved to Central Army Group in the Vitebsk region, where there were signs that a big enemy offensive was pending. If and when this materialized, our task would be to counteract it with an offensive of our own. At the same time, however, he told me that if he and his headquarters should leave Vinitsa, I was to be put in command of Army Group A. After removing Field Marshal List from this appointment without valid reason, following a difference of opinion with him, Hitler had been commanding the Army Group himself as a sort of sideline, a quite impossible arrangement in the long run. More surprising still was what he had to say on this occasion in connection with my eventual appointment as Commander-in-Chief of the Army Group. Next year, he told me, he was thinking of driving through the Caucasus to the Near East with a motorized army group. It was a measure of how unrealistically he still assessed the overall military situation and its strategic possibilities. My last few days on the Leningrad front were marked by the hardest blow that could have befallen my dear wife, myself, and our children in the last war, the death of our eldest son, Jero. He fell for our beloved Germany on 29th October as a second lieutenant in the 51 Panzer Grenadier Regiment of my old 18 Division. I trust, as one under whose command so many thousands of youngsters gave their lives for Germany, that I may be forgiven for mentioning this purely personal loss here. The sacrifice of our son's life was certainly no different from that made by countless other young Germans and their fathers and mothers, but it will be appreciated that there must be a place in these memoirs of mine for the son who gave his life for our fatherland. He shall stand here for all the others who trod the same road as he did, whose sacrifice was the same as his sacrifice, and who live on in the hearts of their dear ones just as our beloved son lives on in ours. Our Gero, born on New Year's Eve 1922 and killed in his 20th year, had been a delicate child from birth. He had suffered from asthma from childhood, and it was due only to the constant care of my wife that he grew up fit enough to become a soldier. Yet while his ailment deprived him of many things in his boyhood, it had also made him unusually mature and determined to do what life demanded of him, despite all his handicaps. Gero was a particularly lovable child, serious, thoughtful, but always happy. After taking his final school examination at the Ritter Academy in Liegnitz in 1940, he expressed the wish to become a soldier and to join my own arm, the infantry, known in Germany as the Queen of the Battlefield, because it has from time immemorial borne the brunt of the fighting. It goes without saying that we, as his parents, understood this desire to follow in the footsteps of generations of ancestors, although neither of us had ever made any attempt to influence him in his choice of a profession. It was simply in his blood to become a regular officer, to be a trainer of German youth, and to be at its head in times of stress. So, having passed his school examinations, he joined 51 Panzer Grenadier Regiment in Liegnitz and went through the 1941 summer campaign in Russia as a private soldier. He was promoted corporal and won the Iron Cross for going back again with other volunteers to pick up a comrade wounded on patrol. In autumn 1941 he was sent home to the officers' school, and in spring 1942 he received his commission. After a serious illness and convalescent leave, he came back to the regiment he loved, now in action on Lake Ilmen as part of 16th Army. I had the joy of seeing him on his way out there when he visited me in my caravan at the front during the Battle of Lake Ladoga. After that, I saw him once more when I visited my friend Bush at 16th Army headquarters on 18th of October. He had invited Gero up as well, so that we, Bush and our dear Specht, my ADC, were able to spend a happy evening together. Specht himself was killed only a few days later. Early on 30th of October 1942, after the morning situation reports had been handed in, my faithful Chief of Staff, General Schultz, the successor to Wöhler, brought me the news that our son Gero had been killed by a Russian bomb the previous night. As assistant adjutant of his battalion, he had been on his way out to the front line to convey an order to a platoon commander. We buried the dear boy on the shores of Lake Ilmen the following day. The Padre of 18 Panzer Grenadier Division, Pastor Kruger, began his oration with the words, "A lieutenant of the infantry." Our son would not have wished it otherwise. After the funeral, I flew home for a few days to be with my dear wife, for whom this boy had throughout the years been a special object of care and devotion. He had given us nothing but joy, for all the anxiety he had caused us by the ailment he had fought so bravely. We laid his soul in God's hands. Gero Erich Sylvester von Manstein, as so many other young Germans, fell in action like the brave soldier he was. The officer's calling was his mission in life, and he fulfilled it with a maturity rare in one so young. If one can speak of a young aristocrat in this sense, then he was one indeed. Not merely in outward appearance, he was tall, slim, and fine-limbed, with long, noble features, but most of all in character and outlook. There was not a single flaw in this boy's make-up. Modest, kind, ever eager to help others, at once serious-minded and cheerful, he had no thought for himself, but knew only comradeship and charity. His mind and spirit were perpetually open to all that is fine and good. It was his heritage to come of a long line of soldiers, but by the very fact of being an ardent German soldier, he was at once a gentleman in the truest sense of the word, a gentleman and a Christian. Whilst I was in Liegnitz after Gero's burial, 11th Army headquarters was moved from Leningrad to Central Army Group's sector in the area of Vitebsk. There is nothing of importance to tell regarding the few weeks it spent there. Before any steps could be taken to use us in counteracting the anticipated offensive, events in the south of the Eastern Front led to our being given a new role. On 20th November, we received orders to assume immediate command of the sector on both sides of Stalingrad as the headquarters of a newly created Don Army Group. I had just been on a trip to the front to visit VD Chevalery's Corps with my Chief of Operations, Colonel Boos, and had been delayed by the explosion of a mine under our train. In that territory, the presence of partisans made it necessary to travel in armoured vehicles or specially protected trains. Because the weather was too bad for flying, we had to leave Vitebsk by rail on 21st November and were once again held up by a mine attack. We reached HQ Army Group B, which was still responsible for our future sector, on 24th November, my 55th birthday. What we learnt here about the situation of 6th Army and the adjacent fronts of 4th Panzer Army and 3rd and 4th Romanian armies will be dealt with in the chapter on Stalingrad. My appointment as commander of Don Army Group brought me for the first time under Hitler's direct orders as Supreme Commander of the Armed Forces, Wehrmacht, and the Army here. Only now did I find myself in a position to see how he tried to fulfill the duties of a supreme war leader besides those of a head of state, for hitherto I had felt his influence on military decisions at best indirectly and from afar. Because of the strict secrecy surrounding all matters of an operational nature, I had been unable to form any valid opinion of my own. During the campaign in Poland, we had been unaware of any interference by Hitler in the leadership of the army. On his 2 visits to Versa Rundstedt's army group, he had listened sympathetically to our interpretations of the situation and agreed to our intentions without making any attempt to intervene. As for the plan for the occupation of Norway, no outsider had known anything whatever about it. Hitler's attitude regarding the offensive in the West has already been discussed in detail. It was certainly both deplorable and alarming that he should have completely passed over OKH in this matter, yet it had to be conceded that his view that the solution must be an offensive one was fundamentally correct from the military point of view, even if the same could not be said of his original timing. Admittedly, he had laid down the outline of a plan which, as has already been pointed out, could hardly have produced a complete solution. At that stage, he had probably not thought it possible to attain results on the scale ultimately achieved. Nevertheless, when the plan put up by Army Group A offered him this possibility, he had immediately grasped the idea and adopted it himself, even though he imposed certain limitations which betrayed his aversion to risks. His fatal mistake of halting the armour outside Dunkirk had not at the time been apparent to an outsider, for the sight of beaches bestrewn with abandoned equipment tended to deceive anyone not yet aware how successful the British had been in getting their troops back across the Channel. The absence of a war plan permitting the timely preparation of an invasion did, however, reveal a failure of Wehrmacht leadership, in other words, on the part of Hitler himself. On the other hand, it was impossible for anyone not actually on the spot to judge whether or not the decision to turn on the Soviet Union was unavoidable for political reasons. The Soviet deployment on the German, Hungarian and Romanian frontiers certainly looked menacing enough. As commander of a corps, and later of 11th Army, I learnt just as little of Hitler's influence on the plan for an attack on the Soviet Union and the conduct of operations in the first phase of the campaign as I did of the plans for the summer offensive in 1942. There had certainly been no interference by Hitler in the handling of the Crimean campaign. Indeed, he had agreed to our intentions without hesitation when I went to see him in spring 1942, and had doubtless done everything to make our success at Sevastopol possible. I have already mentioned that I considered 11th Army to have been wrongly used after the fall of the fortress. Now that I had come immediately under Hitler in my capacity as an army group commander, however, I was to get my first real experience of him in his exercise of the supreme command. When considering Hitler in the role of a military leader, one should certainly not dismiss him with such clichés as the Lance Corporal of World War I. He undoubtedly had a certain eye for operational openings, as had been shown by the way he opted for Army Group A's plan in the West. Indeed, this is often to be found in military amateurs. Otherwise, history would not have recorded so many dukes and princes as successful commanders. In addition, though, Hitler possessed an astoundingly retentive memory and an imagination that made him quick to grasp all technical matters and problems of armaments. He was amazingly familiar with the effect of the very latest enemy weapons, and could reel off whole columns of figures on both our own and the enemy's war production. Indeed, this was his favourite way of sidetracking any topic that was not to his liking. There can be no question that his insight and unusual energy were responsible for many achievements in the sphere of armaments. Yet his belief in his own superiority in this respect ultimately had disastrous consequences. His interference prevented the smooth and timely development of the Luftwaffe, and it was undoubtedly he who hampered the development of rocket propulsion and atomic weapons. Moreover, Hitler's interest in everything technical led him to overestimate the importance of his technical resources. As a result, he would count on a mere handful of assault gun detachments or the new Tiger tanks to restore situations where only large bodies of troops could have any prospect of success. What he lacked, broadly speaking, was simply military ability based on experience, something for which his intuition was no substitute. While Hitler may have had an eye for tactical opportunity and could quickly seize a chance when it was offered to him, he still lacked the ability to assess the prerequisites and practicability of a plan of operations. He failed to understand that the objectives and ultimate scope of an operation must be in direct proportion to the time and forces needed to carry it out, to say nothing of the possibilities of supply. He did not, or would not, realize that any long-range offensive operation calls for a steady build-up of troops over and above those committed in the original assault. All this was brought out with striking clarity in the planning and execution of the 1942 summer offensive. Another example was the fantastic idea he disclosed to me in autumn 1942 of driving through the Caucasus to the Near East and India with a motorized army group. As in the political sphere, at all events after his successes of 1938, so in the military did Hitler lack all sense of judgment regarding what could be achieved and what could not. In autumn 1939, despite his contempt for France's powers of resistance, he had not originally recognized the possibility of attaining decisive success by a correctly planned German offensive. Yet when this success actually became his, he lost his eye for opportunity where conditions were different. What he lacked in each case was a real training in strategy and grand tactics. And so this active mind seized on almost any aim that caught his fancy, causing him to fritter away Germany's strength by taking on several objectives simultaneously, often in the most dispersed theatres of war. The rule that one can never be too strong at the crucial spot, that one may even have to dispense with less vital fronts or accept the risk of radically weakening them in order to achieve a decisive aim, was something he never really grasped. As a result, in the offensives of 1942 and 1943, he could not bring himself to stake everything on success. Neither was he able or willing to see what action would be necessary to compensate for the unfavourable turn which events then took. As for Hitler's strategic aims, at least in the conflict with the Soviet Union, these were to a very great extent conditioned by political considerations and the needs of the German war economy. This has already been indicated in the introductory remarks on the Russian campaign, and will emerge again in connection with the defensive battles of the years 1943-4. Now, questions of a political and economic nature are undoubtedly of great importance when it comes to fixing strategic aims. What Hitler overlooked was that the achievement and, most important of all, the retention of a territorial objective presupposes the defeat of the enemy's armed forces. So long as this military issue is undecided, and this may be seen from the struggle against the Soviet Union, the attainment of territorial aims in the form of economically valuable areas remains problematical, and their long-term retention a sheer impossibility. The day had yet to come when one could wreak such havoc on the enemy's armament centres or transport system with raiding aircraft or guided missiles that he was rendered incapable of continuing the fight. While strategy must unquestionably be an instrument in the hands of the political leadership, the latter must not disregard, as did Hitler to a great extent when fixing operational objectives, the fact that the strategic aim of any war is to smash the military defensive power of the enemy. Only when victory has been secured is the way open to the realization of political and economic aims. This brings me to the factor which probably did more than anything else to determine the character of Hitler's leadership, his overestimation of the power of the will. This will, as he saw it, had only to be translated into faith down to the youngest private soldier for the correctness of his decisions to be confirmed and the success of his orders ensured. Obviously, a strong will in a supreme commander is one of the essential prerequisites of victory. Many a battle has been lost, and many a success thrown away because the supreme leader's will failed at the critical moment. The will for victory which gives a commander the strength to see a grave crisis through is something very different from Hitler's will, which in the last analysis stemmed from a belief in his own mission. Such a belief inevitably makes a man impervious to reason and leads him to think that his own will can operate even beyond the limits of hard reality, whether these consist in the presence of far superior enemy forces, in the conditions of space and time, or merely in the fact that the enemy also happens to have a will of his own. Generally speaking, Hitler had little inclination to relate his own calculations to the probable intentions of the enemy, since he was convinced that his will would always triumph in the end. He was equally disinclined to accept any reports, however reliable, of enemy superiority, even though the latter might be many times stronger than he. Hitler either rejected such reports out of hand, or minimized them with assertions about the enemy's deficiencies, and took refuge in endless recitations of German production figures. In the face of his will, the essential elements of the appreciation of a situation on which every military commander's decision must be based were virtually eliminated. And with that, Hitler turned his back on reality. The only remarkable feature was that this overestimation of his own willpower, this disregard for the enemy's resources and possible intentions, was not matched by a corresponding boldness of decision. The same man who, after his successes in politics up to 1938, had become a political gambler, actually recoiled from risks in the military field. The only bold military decision that may be booked to Hitler's credit was probably the one he took to occupy Norway, and even then the original suggestion had come from Grand Admiral Raeder. Even here, as soon as a crisis cropped up at Narvik, Hitler was on the point of ordering the evacuation of the city and thereby of sacrificing the fundamental aim of the entire operation, which was to keep the iron ore routes open. During the execution of the Western Campaign, too, as we have seen earlier, Hitler showed a certain aversion to taking military risks. The decision to attack the Soviet Union was, in the last analysis, the inevitable outcome of cancelling the invasion of Britain, which Hitler had likewise found too risky. During the Russian campaign, Hitler's fear of risk manifested itself in two ways. One, as will be shown later, was his refusal to accept that elasticity of operations which, in the conditions obtaining from 1943 onwards, could be achieved only by a voluntary, if temporary, surrender of conquered territory. The second was his fear to denude secondary fronts or subsidiary theatres in favour of the spot where the main decision had to fall, even when a failure to do so was palpably dangerous. There are three possible reasons why Hitler evaded these risks in the military field. First, he may secretly have felt that he lacked the military ability to cope with them. This being so, he was even less likely to credit his generals with having it. The second reason was the fear, common to all dictators, that his prestige would be shaken by any setbacks. In practice, this attitude is bound to lead to the commission of military mistakes which damage the man's prestige more than ever. Thirdly, there was Hitler's intense dislike, rooted in his lust for power, of giving up anything on which he had once laid hands. In the same context, mention may be made of another trait of Hitler's, against which his Chief of Staff, Colonel General Zeitzler, and I both battled in vain throughout the period in which I was commanding Don Army Group. Whenever he was confronted with a decision which he did not like taking but could not ultimately evade, Hitler would procrastinate as long as he possibly could. This happened every time it was urgently necessary for us to commit forces to battle in time to forestall an operational success by the enemy, or to prevent its exploitation. The General Staff had to struggle with Hitler for days on end before it could get forces released from less threatened sectors of the front to be sent to a crisis spot. In most cases, he would give too small a number of troops when it was already too late, with the result that he usually finished up by having to grant several times what had originally been required. The tussle used to last for whole weeks when it was a question of abandoning untenable positions like the Donetsk area in 1943 or the Dnieper Bend in 1944. The same applied to the evacuation of unimportant salients on quiet stretches of front for the purpose of acquiring extra forces. Possibly Hitler always expected things to go his way in the end, thereby enabling him to avoid decisions which were repugnant to him, if only because they meant recognizing the fact that he must accommodate himself to the enemy's actions. His inflated belief in his own willpower, a certain aversion to accepting any risk in mobile operations, the retour offensive, for example, when its success could not be guaranteed in advance, and his dislike of giving up anything voluntarily, such were the factors which influenced Hitler's military leadership more and more as time went on. Obstinate defence of every foot of ground gradually became the be-all and end-all of that leadership, And so, after the Wehrmacht had won such extraordinary successes in the first years of war by dint of operational mobility, Hitler's reaction when the first crisis occurred in front of Moscow was to adopt Stalin's precept of hanging on doggedly to every single position. It was a policy that had brought the Soviet leaders so close to the abyss in 1941 that they finally relinquished it when the Germans launched their 1942 offensive. Yet because the Soviet counteroffensive in that winter of 1941 had been frustrated by the resistance of our troops, Hitler was convinced that his ban on any voluntary withdrawal had saved the Germans from the fate of Napoleon's Grand Army in 1812. In this belief, admittedly, he was reinforced by the acquiescent attitude of his own retinue and several commanders at the front. When, therefore, a fresh crisis arose in autumn 1942 after the German offensive had become bogged down outside Stalingrad and in the Caucasus, Hitler again thought the arcanum of success lay in clinging at all costs to what he already possessed. Henceforth he could never be brought to renounce this notion. Now it is generally recognized that defense is the stronger of the two forms of fighting. This is only true, however, when the defense is so efficacious that the attacker bleeds to death when assaulting the defender's positions. Such a thing was out of the question on the Eastern Front, where the number of German divisions available was never sufficient for so strong a defense to be organized. The enemy, being many times stronger than we were, was always able, by massing his forces at points of his own choice, to break through fronts that were far too widely extended. As a result, large numbers of German forces were unable to avoid encirclement. Only in mobile operations could the superiority of the German staffs and fighting troops have been turned to account, and perhaps the forces of the Soviet Union ultimately brought to naught. The effects of Hitler's ever-increasing predilection for hanging on at all costs will be dealt with in greater detail in connection with the defensive battles fought on the Eastern Front in 1943 and 1944. The reason for his insistence on it may be found deep down in his own personality. He was a man who saw fighting only in terms of the utmost brutality. His way of thinking conformed more to a mental picture of masses of the enemy bleeding to death before our lines than to the conception of a subtle fencer who knows how to make an occasional step backwards in order to lunge for the decisive thrust. For the art of war he substituted a brute force which, as he saw it, was guaranteed maximum effectiveness by the willpower behind it. Since Hitler placed the power of force above that of the mind, and, while having every regard for a soldier's bravery, did not rate his ability to the same extent, it is hardly surprising that, in the same way as he overrated technical expedients, he was possessed of la rage du nombre. He would intoxicate himself with the production figures of the German armaments industry, which he had undoubtedly boosted to an amazing extent, even if he preferred to overlook the fact that the enemy's armaments figures were higher still. What he forgot was the amount of training and skill required to render a new weapon fully effective. Once the new weapons had reached the front, he was content. It did not worry him whether the units concerned had mastered them or not, or whether a weapon had even been tested under combat conditions. In just the same way, Hitler was constantly ordering new divisions to be set up. Though an increase in the number of our formations was most desirable, they had to be filled at the cost of replacements for the divisions already in existence, which in course of time were drained of their last drop of blood. At the same time, the newly established formations initially had to pay an excessively high toll of killed because of their lack of battle experience. The Luftwaffe field divisions, the unending series of SS divisions, and finally the so-called People's Grenadier divisions were the most blatant examples. A final point worth mentioning is that although Hitler was always harping on his soldierly outlook and loved to recall that he had acquired his military experience as a frontline soldier, his character had as little in common with the thoughts and emotions of soldiers as had his party with the Prussian virtues which it was so fond of invoking. Hitler was certainly quite clearly informed of conditions at the front through the reports he received from the army groups and armies. In addition, he frequently interviewed officers who had just returned from the front-line areas. Thus, he was not only aware of the achievements of our troops, but also knew what continuous overstrain they had had to endure since the beginning of the Russian campaign. Perhaps this was one of the reasons why we never managed to get Hitler anywhere near a front line in the east. It was hard enough to persuade him to visit our army group headquarters. The idea of going any further forward never occurred to him. It may be that he feared such trips would destroy those golden dreams about his invincible will. Despite the pains Hitler took to stress his own former status as a frontline soldier, I still never had the feeling that his heart belonged to the fighting troops. Losses, as far as he was concerned, were merely figures that reduced fighting power. They are unlikely to have seriously disturbed him as a human being. A former officer of OKW, who was transferred there after being badly wounded at the front, and whose job brought him into almost daily contact with Hitler, mainly at the daily briefings, but also at more private meetings, has written me the following note on this subject. I fully recognize the justification of this subjective feeling, i.e. that Hitler had no sympathy for the fighting troops and regarded losses as mere figures. That was how he appeared among a large body of people, but in reality he was almost the opposite. From a soldier's point of view, he was possibly even too soft and certainly too dependent on his emotions. It was symptomatic that he could not stand any encounter with the horrors of war. He was afraid of his own softness and susceptibility, which would have hampered him in making the decisions that his political will demanded of him. Casualties which he was compelled to deal with personally, or of which he was given realistic descriptions, were a source of horror to him, and obviously caused him as much suffering as the deaths of people he knew. On the strength of several years' observation, I do not believe that this was play acting, but simply one side of his character. Outwardly, therefore, he assumed a deliberate air of indifference to avoid being distracted by the trait of which he himself was afraid. This is also the more deep-seated reason why he did not go to the front or visit any of the bombed cities. It was quite certainly not due to any lack of personal courage, but to the fear of being horrified by what he would see. At private gatherings, it was often noted in conversations about the efforts and achievements of the fighting troops that he had a great appreciation and sympathy for them. The opinion of this officer, who was not one of Hitler's supporters or admirers, at least shows what dissimilar impressions people could have of Hitler's character and mentality, and how difficult it really was to get to the bottom of them. If, as is maintained above, Hitler actually was soft-hearted, how can one explain the brutal cruelty which became increasingly typical of his regime as time went on? Author. In one respect, however, Hitler's outlook was entirely soldier-like in the matter of war decorations. With these, his first and foremost aim was to honour the brave among the fighting men, and the regulations he issued regarding the award of the Iron Cross at the beginning of the campaign were a model of their kind. This decoration, he decided, should be conferred only for deeds of bravery and outstanding leadership, which meant that, as far as the latter category was concerned, it could be won only by formation commanders and their senior staff officers. Unfortunately, many of those responsible for awarding the decoration failed all along to observe this lucid and admirable ruling, partly, it must be admitted, as a result of the delay in creating a cross for meritorious war service, the Kriegsverdienstkreuz, which was intended for those who, though employed on duties rendering them ineligible for the Iron Cross, still deserved distinction. With Hitler, it was always harder to secure a Knight's Cross for a deserving general than for an officer or man at the front. As for the retrospective tendency to deride the many different badges and insignia that Hitler created in the course of the war, people should merely bear in mind what feats our soldiers accomplished during the many long years of its duration. Badges like the Close Combat Clasp, the Nahkampfspange, and the 11th Army Crimean Shield were at all events worn with pride. Besides, the number of medal ribbons worn by soldiers on the other side shows that the question of war decorations is not to be dismissed with a lot of silly talk about tin gongs. The deficiencies I have just described were bound to detract considerably from Hitler's fitness to play the self-appointed role of the supreme military leader. They could still have been counterbalanced, however, if only he had been prepared to take advice from, and place genuine confidence in, an experienced and jointly responsible Chief of the General Staff. He did, after all, possess a number of the qualities indispensable to a supreme commander: a strong will, nerves that would stand up to the most serious crises, an undeniably keen brain and, as I said before, a certain talent in the operational field combined with an ability to recognize possibilities of a technical nature. If only he could have seen his way to compensate for his lack of training and experience in the military sphere, particularly as regards strategy and grand tactics, by utilizing the skill of his Chief of Staff, quite an efficient military leadership might have emerged despite all the shortcomings mentioned above. But this was precisely what Hitler would not accept. Just as he considered the power of his will to be in every way decisive, so had his political successes, and indeed the military victories early in the war, which he regarded as his own personal achievement, caused him to lose all sense of proportion in assessing his own capabilities. To him, the acceptance of advice from a jointly responsible Chief of Staff would not have meant supplementing his own will, but submitting it to that of another. Added to this was the fact that he was imbued by origin and background with an insuperable mistrust of the military leaders, whose code and way of thinking were alien to him. Thus he was not prepared to see a really responsible military advisor alongside himself. He wanted to be another Napoleon, who had only tolerated men under him who would obediently carry out his will. Unfortunately, he had neither Napoleon's military training nor his military genius. I have already shown in the chapter dealing with the plan for the invasion of Britain that Hitler had so organized the Supreme Command that no one was vested with the authority to advise him on grand strategy or to draft a war plan. The Operations Staff, Wehrmachtführungsstab of OKW, which was theoretically qualified to discharge such a task, in practice merely played the role of a military secretariat. Its only raison d'être was to translate Hitler's ideas and instructions into the terminology of military orders. But there was even worse to come. Hitler's designation of Norway as an OKW theatre of operations, in which OKH had no authority, was only the first step in the disruption of land operations. In due course, all the other theatres were gradually turned over to OKW. Finally, only the eastern one remained as an OKH responsibility, and even then it had Hitler at its head. Hence, the Chief of Staff of the army was left with just as little influence on the other theatres of war as were the commanders-in-chief of the two other services in matters of grand strategy. He had no say whatever in the overall distribution of the army's forces, and often did not even know for certain what troops and material were being sent to the various theatres. In the circumstances, it was inevitable that the OKW operations staff and the general staff of the army should clash. Indeed, Hitler probably created clashes deliberately in order that he alone should at all times have the decisive say. Naturally, such faulty organization of the supreme military leadership was bound to contribute decisively to its breakdown. Another consequence of Hitler's overestimation of his willpower and military ability was that he attempted more and more to interfere by separate orders of his own in the running of subordinate formations. It has always been the special forte of German military leadership that it relies on commanders at all levels to show initiative and willingness to accept responsibility, and does everything in its power to promote such qualities. That is why, as a matter of principle, the directives of higher commands and the orders of medium and lower commands always contained so-called assignments for subordinate formations. The detailed execution of these assignments was the business of the subordinate commanders concerned. This system of handling orders was largely the reason for the successes scored by the German army over its opponents, whose own orders generally governed the actions of subordinate commanders down to the very last detail. Only when there was no other possible alternative left did anyone on our side encroach upon the authority of a subordinate formation headquarters by specifically laying down the action it should take. Hitler, on the other hand, thought he could see things much better from behind his desk than the commanders at the front. He ignored the fact that much of what was marked on his far too detailed situation maps was obviously out of date. From that distance, moreover, he could not possibly judge what was the proper and necessary action to take on the spot. He had grown increasingly accustomed to interfering in the running of the army groups, armies, and lower formations by issuing special orders, which were not his concern at all. While I had hitherto been spared such interference in my own sphere of command, I was forewarned of it by what Field Marshal Versus Klug had to tell me when I met him on a railway station on my way from Vitebsk to Rostov. At Central Army Group, he said, he had to consult Hitler before any operation involving forces of a battalion or more could be mounted. Even if I personally did not experience such intolerable interference later on, there were still to be quite enough clashes with the Supreme Command as a result of Hitler's meddling. In contrast to his passion for individual orders, which were usually nothing but a hindrance to command staffs and detrimental to operations, Hitler was loath to issue long-term operational directives. The more he came to regard the principle of holding on at all costs as the alpha and omega of his policy, the less prepared was he to issue long-term directives which took account of the normally foreseeable development of a strategic situation. That such methods must ultimately have placed him at a disadvantage vis-à-vis the enemy was something he refused to see. His mistrust of his subordinate commanders prevented him from giving them, in the form of long-term directives, freedom of action, which they might put to a use that was not to his liking. The effect of this, however, was to do away with the very essence of leadership. In the long run, even an army group could not get along without directives from the Supreme Command, certainly not when it formed part of a larger front and was bound to its neighbours on either flank. We often thought nostalgically of our days in the Crimea, when we had been able to fight in a theatre all of our own. It still remains for me to show, in as far as I can do so from personal experience, what pattern the disputes took which inevitably arose between Hitler and the army leaders as a result of his attitude to questions of military leadership. Many of the accounts on record depict him as foaming at the mouth and even taking an occasional bite at the carpet. Although he did undoubtedly lose all self-control on occasions, the only time he ever raised his voice or behaved badly when I was present was during the episode with Halder, which I have already mentioned. Hitler obviously sensed just how far he could afford to go with his interlocutor and what people he could hope to intimidate with outbursts of rage that may often have been simulated. I must say that as far as my own personal contacts with him went, he maintained appearances and kept things on a factual plane even when our views collided. On the one occasion when he did become personal, the extremely sharp retort it evoked was accepted in silence. Hitler had a masterly knack of psychologically adapting himself to the individual whom he wished to bring round to his point of view. In addition, of course, he always knew anyone's motive for coming to see him, and could thus have all his counter-arguments ready beforehand. His faculty for inspiring others with his own confidence, whether feigned or genuine, was quite remarkable. This particularly applied when officers who did not know him well came to see him from the front. In such cases, a man who had set out to tell Hitler the truth about things out there came back converted and bursting with confidence. In the various disputes I had with Hitler on operational matters in my capacity as an army group commander, what impressed me most was the incredible tenacity with which he would defend his point of view. There was almost invariably a tussle of several hours' duration before his visitor either attained his object or retired empty-handed, at best consoled with empty promises. I have known no other man who could show anything like the same staying power in a discussion of this kind. And while the maximum time involved in any dispute with a front-line commander would at worst be several hours, the Chief of Staff, General Zeitzler, often had to battle for days on end at the evening conferences in order to get Hitler to take the necessary action. Whenever one of these contests was in progress, we always used to ask Zeitzler what round they had reached. Besides, the arguments with which Hitler defended his point of view, and I include the purely military ones here, were not usually of a kind that could be dismissed out of hand. After all, in any discussion of operational intentions, one is almost always dealing with a matter whose outcome nobody can predict with absolute certainty. Nothing is certain in war when all is said and done. Whenever Hitler perceived that he was not making any impression with his opinions on strategy, he immediately produced something from the political or economic sphere. Since he had a knowledge of the political and economic situations with which no frontline commander could compete, his arguments here were generally irrefutable. As a last resort, all one could do was to insist that if he did not agree to the proposals or demands submitted to him, things would go wrong militarily and in turn have even worse repercussions in the political and economic fields. On the other hand, Hitler frequently showed himself to be a very good listener even when he did not like what was being asked of him, and on such occasions he was quite capable of objective discussion. Naturally, no relationship of any intimacy could develop between this fanatical dictator, who thought only of his political aspirations and lived in a belief in his mission, and the military leaders. The personal element obviously did not interest Hitler in the least. To him, human beings were merely tools in the service of his political ambitions. From his own side, there sprang no bond of loyalty to the German soldier. The ever more apparent defects in Germany's military leadership, some of which arose from Hitler's character and others from the quite impossible organization of the Supreme Command outlined earlier on, naturally raised the question of whether anything could be done to bring about a change. I prefer to leave the political aspects aside here, as indeed I have done everywhere else in this book. I made no less than 3 attempts in the interest of a more rational conduct of the war to persuade Hitler to accept some modification of the Supreme Command. From no other quarter, as far as I know, was the inadequacy of his military leadership ever put to him quite so bluntly. I was fully alive to the fact that Hitler would never be prepared to relinquish the Supreme Command officially. As a dictator, he could not possibly have done so without suffering what for him would have been an intolerable loss of prestige. In my opinion, everything depended, therefore, on persuading Hitler, while nominally retaining the position of Supreme Commander, to leave the conduct of military operations in all theatres of war to one responsible Chief of Staff and to appoint a special Commander-in-Chief for the Eastern Theatre. These attempts of mine, which unfortunately proved unavailing, will be discussed further when I come to deal with the events of the years 1943–4. For me, they were a particularly precarious undertaking, for Hitler knew full well that I was the very man many people in the army would like to see in the position of a proper Chief of Staff, or as Commander-in-Chief in the East. It is not my intention here to go into the question of changing the leadership of the Reich by violent means, as exemplified by the events of 20th of July 1944, although I may do so one day. Within the scope of these war memoirs, it is enough to say that as one responsible for an army group in the field, I did not feel I had the right to contemplate a coup d'état in wartime, because in my own view it would have led to an immediate collapse of the front and probably to chaos inside Germany. Apart from this, there was always the question of the military oath and the admissibility of murder for political motives. As I said at my trial, no senior military commander can for years on end expect his soldiers to lay down their lives for victory and then precipitate defeat by his own hand. In any case, it was already clear by that time that not even a coup d'état would make any difference to the Allied demand for unconditional surrender. At the time when I held a command, we had not, to my mind, reached the point where such action had to be regarded as the only possible solution. Stranger, to Sparta say, her faithful band, here lie in death, remembering her command. Never will these lines, telling of the heroism of the defenders of Thermopylae and ever after regarded as the song of praise to bravery, fidelity, and soldierly obedience, be carved in stone at Stalingrad in memory of 6th Army's martyrdom on the Volga. Nor is any cross or cenotaph likely to be raised over the vanished traces of the German soldiers who starved, froze, and died there. Yet the memory of their indescribable suffering, their unparalleled heroism, fidelity, and devotion to duty will live on long after the victors' cries of triumph have died away, and the bereaved, the disillusioned, and the bitter at heart have fallen silent. The Battle of Stalingrad is understandably treated by the Soviets as the turning point of the war. The British ascribe similar importance to the Battle of Britain. The Americans are inclined to attribute the Allies' final success to their own entry into hostilities. In Germany, too, many people feel constrained to regard Stalingrad as the decisive battle of World War II. In point of fact, not one of these individual events should really be rated as decisive. The outcome of the war was decided by a wealth of factors, the most significant of which was probably the hopelessly inferior position in which Germany ultimately found herself vis-à-vis her opponents in consequence of Hitler's policies and strategy. Stalingrad was certainly a turning point to the extent that the wave of German offensives broke on the Volga, to recede like a breaker on the ebbing tide. But grave though the loss of Sixth Army undoubtedly was, it still need not have meant that the war in the East, and ipso facto the war as a whole, was irretrievably lost. It would still have been conceivable to force a stalemate if Germany's policies and military leadership had been adapted to such a solution. The cause of Sixth Army's destruction at Stalingrad is obviously to be found in Hitler's refusal, doubtless mainly for reasons of prestige, to give up the city voluntarily. Yet the fact that Sixth Army could ever land in such a situation at all was due to the operational errors committed beforehand by the Supreme Command in the planning and execution of the 1942 offensive, most of all with regard to its final stages. The plight in which the German southern wing found itself in the late autumn of 1942 as a result of these mistakes will be dealt with in the chapter on the winter campaign of 1942-3. All I propose to do here is to bring out the points which settled the fate of Sixth Army. Thanks to the fact that Hitler's strategic objectives were governed chiefly by the needs of his war economy, the German offensive of 1942 had split into two different directions, the Caucasus and Stalingrad. By the time the German advance came to a halt, therefore, a front had emerged to hold which there were not enough German forces available. To make things worse, no strategic reserve existed, the Supreme Command having squandered 11th Army in every conceivable direction. Immediately it became free in the Crimea. Army Group A, with its front facing south, was located in the north of the Caucasus between the Black Sea and the Caspian. Army Group B held a front facing east and northeast, which began on the Volga south of Stalingrad and bent back north of the city to join the Middle Don, along which it continued to a point north of Voronezh. Neither of the two army groups was strong enough to hold fronts of this length, particularly if one bore in mind that despite its heavy losses, the enemy's southern wing had been able to avoid destruction and was not really beaten at all. Apart from this, the enemy had very strong strategic reserves in his other sectors, as well as in the hinterland. Last but not least, a gap 190 miles wide yawned between the two army groups in the Kalmyk steppes, guarded only by the quite inadequate resources of one division, 16 motorized, based on Yelista. The attempt to hold this overextended front for any length of time constituted the first of the mistakes which were to plunge Sixth Army into its desperate situation at the end of November 1942. The second and even more fatal mistake was that Hitler compelled Army Group B to tie down its principal striking force, 4th Panzer and 6th Armies, in the fighting in and around Stalingrad. The job of protecting the deep northern flank of this group along the Don was left to 3rd Romanian Army, 1 Italian and 1 Hungarian Army, and, in the Voronezh sector, to the weak 2nd German Army. Hitler must have known that even behind the Don the Allied armies could not stand up to a strong Soviet attack. The same was true of 4th Romanian Army, which he had entrusted with the task of guarding the open right flank of 4th Panzer Army. The attempt to gain control of the Volga by taking Stalingrad in a set battle after the original assault had been only partially successful, would at best have been admissible on a very short-term basis. But to leave the main body of the army group at Stalingrad for weeks on end with inadequately protected flanks was a cardinal error. It amounted to nothing less than presenting the enemy with the initiative we ourselves had resigned on the whole southern wing, and was a clear invitation to him to surround Sixth Army. A third mistake was the utterly grotesque chain of command on the German southern wing. Army Group A had no commander of its own whatever. It was commanded by Hitler in what might be called a part-time capacity. Army Group B had no fewer than 7 armies under command, including 4 Allied ones. No army group headquarters can cope with more than 5 armies at the outside, and when most of these are Allied ones, the task inevitably becomes too much for it. HQ Army Group B had quite rightly established itself at Starobielsk, behind the defensive front on the Don, in order to keep a better eye on the Allied armies. The choice of this location, however, also meant that the headquarters was much too distant from the right wing of its sector. Another factor was that by his frequent interference in the conduct of operations, Hitler largely deprived the Army Group headquarters of control of 6th Army. It is true that OKH had recognized these command problems and made plans to create a new Don Army Group under Marshal Antonescu. The new headquarters had not been set up, however, as Hitler first wished to see Stalingrad fall. This failure to use the Romanian marshal was a serious mistake. Admittedly, his capacity for command was untried so far, but he was certainly a good soldier. In any case, his presence would have lent greater weight to our calls for further forces to guard the flanks of the Stalingrad front. He was, after all, a head of state and an ally to whom Hitler had to pay greater heed than to German army group and army commanders. Above all, Antonescu's personality would have served to brace up the senior Romanian commanders, who respected this man no less than they did the Russians. It was clear from an impassioned letter he wrote me after my assumption of command that the Marshal had on several occasions called attention to the dangers of the situation in general and that of 3rd Romanian Army in particular. As long as he did not hold a responsible command at the front, however, these comments of his inevitably lacked the emphasis they would have carried if uttered by a head of state simultaneously answerable for the sector that was threatened. It was equally clear that neither Army Group B nor 6th Army had failed to give warning of the big offensive the enemy was preparing to launch against the covering fronts on each side of Stalingrad. Finally, mention should be made of a fact which had grave repercussions on the position of 6th Army and the entire southern wing. The whole of Army Group A, as well as 4th Panzer and 6th Armies, 3rd and 4th Romanian Armies and the Italian Army, were based on a single Dnieper crossing, the railway bridge at Dnipropetrovsk. The repair of the Zaporozhye railway bridge and the link across the Ukraine through Nikolaev and Kherson to the Crimea and thence across the Straits of Kerch had either been discontinued or was not yet complete. The north-to-south link behind the German lines was equally unsatisfactory. When it came to bringing up fresh troops or quickly switching forces behind the front, therefore, the German Supreme Command found itself at a permanent disadvantage vis-à-vis the enemy, who had much more efficient communications at his disposal in every direction. Every commander-in-chief must run risks if he wants to succeed. The risk undertaken by the Supreme Command in the late autumn of 1942, however, should never have consisted in tying down the most hard-hitting forces of Army Group B at Stalingrad over a long period in which it was content to leave the Don front covered by such an easily destructible screen. One possible argument in the Supreme Command's favour is that it was quite unprepared for the Allied armies to break down so completely. Yet the Romanians, who were still the best of our allies, fought exactly as our experiences in the Crimea implied they would. Any illusions about the Italians' fighting capacities, of course, were inexcusable from the start. The risk which the German command ought to have taken, after the summer offensive had merely won us more territory without bringing about the decisive defeat of the Soviet southern wing, consisted in returning to mobile operations between the Caucasus and middle reaches of the Don, with due advantage being taken of the large bend of the river, in order to prevent the enemy from attaining the initiative. But to substitute one risk for another was not in keeping with Hitler's mentality. By failing to take appropriate action after his offensive had petered out without achieving anything definite, he paved the way to the tragedy of Stalingrad. The OKH order received by 11th Army Headquarters on 21st November in the Vitebsk area laid down that for the purpose of stricter coordination of the armies involved in the arduous defensive battles to the west and south of Stalingrad, we were to take over command of 4th Panzer Army, 6th Army and 3rd Romanian Army as HQ Don Army Group. Since we lacked a Quartermaster General's branch, we were to be joined by the one already formed for Marshal Antonescu. It was headed by Colonel Fink, a General Staff officer whose soundness of character was matched only by his extraordinary talent for organising supply and transport, and who in due course mastered all the supply difficulties with which the Army Group constantly found itself confronted. The airlift to 6th Army, unfortunately, was outside his control. After my recall in April 1944, Colonel Fink was transferred to the staff of the Commander-in-Chief in the West, where, I am told, he soon had supply and transport in a state as near perfection as the enemy's complete domination of the skies permitted. As one of the men implicated in the conspiracy against Hitler, he was executed after 20th of July 1944. Don Army Group's task, as defined in the OKH order, was to bring the enemy attacks to a standstill and recapture the positions previously occupied by US. Initially, the only reinforcements promised us were a corps headquarters and a division which were to be moved up to Milerovo, behind the future right wing of Army Group B. It may be gathered from the wording of our task and the insignificance of the proposed reinforcements that when issuing this order, OKH still did not realise the danger of the situation around Stalingrad, although the ring had closed around 6th Army that very day. Further information was forthcoming in Vitebsk and during a train stop when I was able to talk to Field Marshal versus Kluge and his Chief of Staff, General Wöhler. From this I gathered that the enemy had broken through 3rd Romanian Army's front on the Don northwest of Stalingrad in very great strength. Between 1 and 2 Soviet tank armies were involved, in addition to a great deal of cavalry, in all some 30 formations. The same thing had happened south of Stalingrad to 4th Romanian Army, which was under command of 4th Panzer Army. Before leaving Vitebsk, therefore, I sent the Chief of the General Staff a teleprinter message pointing out that in view of the magnitude of the enemy effort, our task at Stalingrad could not be merely a matter of regaining a fortified stretch of front. What we should need to restore the situation would be forces amounting to an army in strength, none of which, if possible, should be used for a counteroffensive until their assembly was fully complete. General Zeitzler agreed with me and promised to try to let us have an armoured division and 2 or 3 infantry divisions by way of addition. I also teleprinted a request to Army Group B that 6th Army be instructed to withdraw forces quite ruthlessly from its defence fronts in order to keep its rear free at the Don crossing at Kalach. Whether this instruction was ever passed to 6th Army, I have been unable to discover. Not until we arrived at HQ Army Group B in Starobielsk on 24th of November did we obtain a clear picture of recent events and the current situation from the commander, Colonel General Baron versus Wykes, and his Chief of Staff, General Vesus Sodenstern. In the early hours of 19th November, after a tremendous artillery barrage, the enemy had broken out of his Don bridgehead at Kremenskaya and had also crossed the river further west to attack both the left wing of 6th Army, 11 Corps, and 3rd Romanian Army, 4 and 5 Romanian Corps. Simultaneously, he had launched a strong attack against 4th Panzer Army, Colonel General Hoth, south of Stalingrad, where it was intermingled with 4th Romanian Army. While the left wing of 6th Army had held firm, the enemy had been able to overrun the Romanians completely on both fronts. At each of the 2 points of penetration, strong Soviet tank forces had immediately pushed through in depth, just as we had taught them to do. By an early hour on 21st of November, they had already linked up on the Don at Kalach, where the bridge so vital for the supply of 6th Army had fallen into their hands intact. Since the forenoon of that day, therefore, the ring had been closed around 6th Army and the German and Romanian elements of 4th Panzer Army, which had been squeezed back into the pocket from the area south of Stalingrad. The encircled troops included 5 German corps totaling 20 divisions, 2 Romanian corps, the mass of the army artillery not on the Leningrad front, and large numbers of army engineer units. Even later on, the army group was unable to obtain any exact data on the sum total of German soldiers trapped in the pocket. The returns sent in by 6th Army fluctuated between 200,000 and 270,000 men. But it must be remembered here that the stated ration strengths included not only the Romanian troops, but also many thousand indigenous volunteers, the so-called Hiwis, and prisoners of war. The most commonly quoted figure of over 300,000 is undoubtedly exaggerated. Various communication zone troops were left outside the pocket, as were part of the B echelon transport, a number of the wounded, and all ranks on leave. These residual elements, which later formed the cadres with which most of the 6th Army divisions were reconstituted, still amounted to anything between 1,500 and 3,000 men per division. If one bears in mind that the divisions of 6th Army had already fallen off in strength in November, the estimate that there were 200,000 to 220,000 men in the pocket, even allowing for the strong complement of army artillery and engineers, is probably fairly accurate. The situation on 24th November was approximately as follows. The only intact formations left to 4th Panzer Army were 16 motorized division on its southern wing, widely extended across the steppes on both sides of Yelista, and 18 Romanian division on the northern side. All the other Romanians had either been thrown back into Stalingrad or overrun. With what remnants of the Romanian units it could scrape together, plus various German communications zone troops, the army tried to hold an emergency defence line forward of Kotelnikovo and was not attacked again for the time being. What was left of 4th Romanian Army, including the headquarters, was placed under command of Colonel General Hoth. After the Romanian collapse, his 4 corps, which had been part of the front south of Stalingrad, had swung back onto a front south and southwest of Stalingrad and had come under command of 6th Army. 6th Army, consisting of 4, 8, 11 and 51 Army Corps and 14 Panzer Corps, was surrounded at Stalingrad. It had taken 11 corps and elements of 8 corps out of the front facing north on both sides of the Don and put them into the pocket's newly formed western front, the salient tip of which reached to a point east of the Kalach Bridge. A new southern front had been formed out of reserves and those elements of 4th Panzer, or 4th Romanian Army, which had been thrown back to Stalingrad. The pocket measured about 30 miles across from east to west, and 25 miles from north to south. Both wings of 3rd Romanian Army had been broken through. In its centre, a group of about 3 divisions under the same General Laskar, who had distinguished himself at Sevastopol, had put up a brave resistance, but they had since been surrounded and were now thought to have been captured. 48. Panzer Corps, which had been in reserve behind the front facing the Don bridgehead, had launched what appears to have been a belated counterattack, but this had proved unsuccessful. Both its divisions were now encircled and under orders to fight their way out to the west. The corps commander, General Heim, had already been replaced on orders from Hitler and summoned to the latter's headquarters. There Hitler had him sentenced to death at a court-martial presided over by Goering, who was always available for tasks of this kind, on the ground that he, General Heim, was to blame for his corps' failure. Heim was later rehabilitated when it was found that his forces had indeed been too weak for the task confronting them. 48. Corps consisted of the newly formed Romanian Armoured Division, which had had no battle experience whatever, and 22 Panzer Division, which had obviously not been up to standard from a technical point of view. For all practical purposes, 3rd Romanian Army had only about 3 divisions still in existence. They were those of 1 and 2 Romanian Corps, which had not been drawn into the battle and were located next to the Italians on the Don. In the opinion of Army Group B, 6th Army had at most 2 days' ammunition and 6 days' rations left. These estimates were subsequently found to have been too low. The airlift to date, insofar as the weather had permitted one to operate at all, had provided only 1/10 of the army's requirements of ammunition and fuel. 100 Junkers aircraft, equivalent to a working load of 200 tons less the inevitable losses, had been promised, and others were to follow. Intelligence reports showed that the enemy had poured some 24 formations, i.e. divisions and armoured or mechanized brigades, through the gap he had torn in the front south of Stalingrad. These had then wheeled north against the southern flank of 6th Army, which they were fiercely attacking. From the point where he had penetrated 3rd Romanian Army, the enemy had also pushed about 24 formations through towards Kallach in the rear of 6th Army. About 23 more had been reported further west, advancing south and southwest towards the Chir. In addition, there were the Soviet troops in Stalingrad, who had held out all along against 6th Army's attacks and were now being reinforced across the Volga, as well as the superior forces still opposite the northern front of 6th Army between the Volga and Don. Finally, there was no doubt that the enemy was continuously bringing up reinforcements by rail. Even by 28th November, a total of 143 major formations, i.e. divisions, armoured brigades, etc., had been identified in the operations area of the new Don Army Group. The forces to form Don Army Group under my command were as follows. First, there was 6th Army, surrounded at Stalingrad by an enemy roughly 3 times as strong, and composed of 20 very tired German and 2 Romanian divisions. Its stocks of ammunition, fuel and food were running low, and there was no steady inflow of supplies to build them up again. Quite apart from the fact that it was surrounded, the army enjoyed no operational freedom whatever, having received categorical orders from Hitler to hold fast to the fortress of Stalingrad. Next came the remnants of 4th Panzer Army and the 2 Romanian armies. The best forces we possessed at present were one hitherto untouched German division, 16 motorized, which could not be withdrawn from its defensive positions out in the steppes because it constituted Army Group A's only cover from the rear, and 4 still intact Romanian divisions, whose combat value was unquestionably inferior to that of the Russians. 6th Army's subordination to HQ Don Army Group was more or less a fiction. However, in practice, it had hitherto come directly under OKH. It was Hitler who had tied it down at Stalingrad, when it might still have been able to fight its own way out. Now, operationally speaking, it was immobilized. The army group could no longer command it, but merely give it assistance. Besides, Hitler was still maintaining his direct control of 6th Army by a General Staff liaison officer who was installed with his own signals section at 6th Army headquarters. Even in the matter of supplies, Hitler had the final say, since he alone had the means at his disposal to maintain the army from the air. Strictly speaking, therefore, I should have been right to decline to have 6th Army in my army group, and to insist that it formally remain under the direct orders of OKH. I did not do so at the time, because I hoped that I should be in a better position than OKH to ensure the direct cooperation of the relieving forces with the encircled army. Why this cooperation did not materialize in the decisive phase will be shown later. Apart from 6th Army, which being surrounded was unusable in the operational sense, all that Don Army Group found awaiting it initially were mere remnants. It was envisaged that the Army Group should receive the following new forces, to be allocated as below. Forces from Tyrol. HQ 57 Corps, 23 Panzer Division, Strong Army Artillery Army Group, a 4th PES, Army Relief Drive on Stalingrad from south. 6 Panzer Division, recently brought up to strength. West 1 Corps HQ, 4-5 divisions, 3rd Romanian Army, left wing. To relieve Stalingrad by advance eastwards from Upper Chir as Army Detachment Hollit. At HQ Army Group B, I was shown a message which General Paulus, the commander of 6th Army, had radioed to Hitler on, to the best of my recollection, 22nd or 23rd November. It stated that he and all his corps commanders considered it absolutely imperative that the army should break out to the southwest. To raise the forces needed for such an operation, however, he would have to shift certain formations around inside the army, and for the purpose of economizing in troops, take his northern front back onto a shorter line. The view taken at Army Group headquarters was that even if Hitler had given immediate approval, no breakout could have started before 28th November. However, Hitler had turned the request down and forbidden any retraction of the northern front. To make his point quite clear, he had entrusted General Seydlitz with command of the whole front in question. The staff of Don Army Group had neither the time nor the opportunity to retrace past events in 6th Army. Evidently, General Paulus did everything possible, within the limits of Hitler's order binding him to Stalingrad, to extract forces from those of his army fronts which were not so seriously threatened in the first instance. By pulling in 4 corps of 4th Panzer Army, he was able to assemble a new front on his open south flank. Furthermore, he tried to keep his rear free by throwing 14 Panzer Corps from the eastern to the western bank of the Don. Unfortunately, it ran into superior Soviet forces west of the river. At the very same time, 11 Corps, which was still holding its position west of the Don with a front facing north, was attacked in the rear. This situation led 6th Army to pull both corps back into a bridgehead west of the Don and subsequently across the river to the east, so that it could form an all-round front between the Don and Volga. Although these measures prevented 6th Army from being plunged into the vortex of defeat which had engulfed its neighbours, they also inevitably led to its encirclement. What must be made perfectly clear, on the other hand, is that it was the Supreme Command's business to issue an order affording 6th Army the opportunity to acquire operational elbow room, and thereby to avoid being surrounded. A far-sighted leader would have realized from the start that to mass the whole of the German assault forces in and around Stalingrad without adequate flank protection placed them in mortal danger of being enveloped as soon as the enemy broke through the adjacent fronts. When the Soviets unleashed their big offensive across the Don and south of Stalingrad on 19th of November, the German leaders must have known what was coming. From that moment onwards, it was inadmissible to wait until the enemy had overrun the Romanians, for even if their armies had not been carved up so quickly, it would still have been necessary to use 6th Army in a mobile role in order to master the situation on the southern wing of Army Group B. By the evening of 19th November at the latest, therefore, OKH should have given 6th Army fresh orders allowing it freedom to manoeuvre. Without going into the details of the first few days of the Soviet offensive, one may safely say that the encirclement of 6th Army could only have been prevented if the latter had attempted a breakout in the very early stages, either by crossing the Don to the west or by striking southwest along the east side of the river. The onus of ordering it to do so lay with the Supreme Command. While General Paulus should certainly have taken his own decision to disengage from Stalingrad, he could hardly have done so as early as OKH, not being briefed, as the latter was, on the situation in the neighbouring army areas. By 22nd or 23rd November, when he did ask for permission to break out, the vital hour may already have been missed. The fact that it was a serious psychological error to put this request to Hitler at all is another matter. Paulus had been acquainted with Hitler's views on the war in the East since the winter of 1941, when he had been Oberquartiermeister the Firm at OKH. He was aware that Hitler credited himself with having saved the German army from the disaster of a Napoleonic retreat that winter by ordering every foot of ground to be held. He must have realized that after Hitler's remarks about Stalingrad in his Sportpalast speech, the dictator would never agree to evacuation. The city's name was too closely bound up with his own military reputation. Thus, the only solution would have been to confront him with the fait accompli of the army's disengagement from Stalingrad. It is conceivable, of course, that such action might have cost Paulus his head. Yet no one must think that it was any fear of what might happen to him personally that kept Paulus from taking things into his own hands and doing what he believed to be right. It is more likely to have been loyalty to Hitler which impelled him to try to get the army's breakout authorized, particularly as he was in direct touch with OKH by radio. And, as I have already pointed out, he can hardly have had a sufficiently clear picture of the overall situation. The difficulty of deciding to act on his own initiative may also have been increased by the fact that a breakout would momentarily have meant a bigger risk to the army than forming a hedgehog position in Stalingrad. For the time being, HQ Don Army Group was unable to take a hand in events by issuing any orders of its own. It could not take over its full responsibilities until such time as I arrived in Novocherkassk, the place earmarked as our headquarters location, with a reasonably complete operations staff and the necessary channels of communication had been established. Neither would be the case for some days yet. For one thing, our aircraft had been grounded by a blizzard in the central sector, as a result of which we were having to continue the journey by train. Nonetheless, as the future commander of the army group, I had to make up my mind on one thing straight away on the basis of the situation report given to us on 24th November. Ought 6th Army, if possible, to effect a breakout even at this late stage, or would it not be better, now that the first chance of doing so had undoubtedly been missed, to wait until a relief force could drive out to meet it? After careful reflection, and in complete agreement with my Chief of Staff, General Schultz, and the Chief of Operations, Colonel Boos, I came to this conclusion. The enemy would in the first instance do everything in his power to destroy the encircled 6th Army. At the same time, we had to bear in mind the possibility that he would try to exploit the collapse of 3rd Romanian Army by pushing mechanized forces across the large bend of the Don towards Rostov, where he was offered the prospect of cutting off the rear communications not only of 6th and 4th Panzer Armies, but also of Army Group A. The forces at the enemy's disposal, which he could doubtless augment by road and rail transport, would allow him to pursue the two aims simultaneously. I further concluded that the Army Group's foremost task must in any case be the liberation of 6th Army. On the one hand, the fate of 200,000 German soldiers was at stake. On the other, unless the army were kept in existence and ultimately set free, there could hardly be any hope of restoring the situation on the right wing of the Eastern Front. One thing was clear. Even if we were able to raise the siege and re-establish contact, 6th Army must on no account be left at Stalingrad. The city's prestige value, as far as we were concerned, was non-existent. On the contrary, if we should succeed in getting the army out, it would be urgently needed to give the maximum possible help in stabilizing the situation on the southern wing sufficiently to bring us safely through the winter. The immediate question, however, was whether 6th Army, having once missed its real opportunity to break out, should try to do so at this particular moment. As 2 days had passed since General Paulus's request to Hitler, the attempt could not, according to Army Group B, begin before 29th or 30th November. By then the enemy would already have had more than a week in which to tighten his hold on the pocket. The army would have the choice of only 2 escape routes, and in either case the enemy would be ready for it. One possibility was to break out towards the Don crossing at Kalach, but even if the army managed to pierce the encircling ring in this direction, there would still be the Don to bar its passage. Although most of the ammunition would have been expended on the original breakthrough, the army would now have to force a crossing against the powerful forces advancing west of the river towards the Lower Chir against negligible opposition. Its prospects of getting across when it was short of ammunition and hard pressed by the enemy from north, east and south seemed more than doubtful. Conditions might be slightly better if 6th Army were to try to break through to the remnants of 4th Panzer Army by moving in a southwesterly direction east of the Don, though here too the enemy would be ready for it. The objection in this case was that even if the actual breakthrough were successful, the army could not count on there being any German forces to meet it in the first instance. On its heels would be the Soviet armies now opposite its eastern, northern and western fronts around Stalingrad, while west of the river the enemy would be able to follow it southwards and forestall all its attempts to effect a crossing to the west. Most probably the army would sooner or later have no choice but to stand and fight out in the steppes without adequate supplies of ammunition, fuel or food. Some elements, such as tank units, might possibly get away, but the fate of the army as a whole would be sealed. The Soviet forces it had been engaging till then would be released, and this in turn was likely to lead to the destruction of the German army's entire southern wing, including Army Group A, which was still out in the Caucasus. For the sake of both Sixth Army and the situation on the southern wing generally, our aim had to be to get the former out of the pocket intact and in fighting trim. This might have been done already if the Supreme Command had granted it operational freedom as soon as the danger of its encirclement became apparent. By now, however, it seemed too late for the army to break free and remain fit for further action without the extraneous help of relief forces. On the other hand, it could be assumed that once the two relief groups moved off, Sixth Army's position would be substantially easier in the operational sense, even if not for the initial breakthrough. Once the enemy advancing west of the Don were engaged by other forces, Sixth Army would at least be spared the prospect of having to fight that particular opponent. And if, at the same time as Sixth Army moved off, the other relief group were to thrust into the rear of the Soviet siege front east of the Don, the enemy would be compelled to weaken the latter and thereby to facilitate the beleaguered army's initial breakthrough. Although the Holit relief group was finally never committed in that role, it did in fact tie down the Soviet forces operating west of the Don. The advance of 4th Panzer Army, on the other hand, forced the enemy to weaken his front around Stalingrad considerably. Author. At the same time, the fact had to be faced that any delay was dangerous, since it would give the enemy time to consolidate his siege front. Such a risk could only be entertained if the Supreme Command guaranteed to supply Sixth Army by air for as long as was needed to liberate it. Such was the premise for not now resorting to the desperate solution of an isolated breakout by Sixth Army, but for awaiting a fresh opportunity. This would present itself as soon as the relief groups could go in. In the light of the foregoing, I informed the Chief of Staff of the Army by telephone that the Army Group's views were as follows. A breakout by Sixth Army to the southwest was probably still possible even now. To leave the army at Stalingrad any longer constituted an extreme risk, in view of the ammunition and fuel shortage. Nevertheless, since we considered that the best chance for an independent breakout had already been missed, it was preferable from the operational point of view at the present time to wait until the projected relief groups could come to the army's aid, always assuming that an adequate airlift could be counted upon. The latter factor, we emphasized, was absolutely decisive. The relief operation could be launched with the forces due to arrive at the beginning of December. To achieve real effect, however, it would require a steady flow of further reinforcements, as the enemy would also be throwing in powerful forces on his own side. An isolated breakout by Sixth Army might still become necessary if strong enemy pressure were to prevent us from deploying these new forces. An absolute prerequisite for accepting the risk of not making an immediate breakout from Stalingrad was that Sixth Army should daily receive 400 tons of supplies by air. 400 tons daily was the Army's minimum requirement of vehicle fuel and infantry and armour-piercing ammunition. After the ration stocks, etc., had been exhausted, this basic minimum rose to 550 tons. I made it perfectly clear in this conversation that unless the delivery of supplies could be guaranteed, one could not risk leaving Sixth Army in its present situation any longer, however temporarily. Anyone who witnessed the subsequent tragedy of Stalingrad, Hitler's mulish determination to hold on to the city, OKH's deliberate failure to take the very last chance offered to it, a subject on which more will be said in due course. The delays which occurred in assembling the relief group of 4th Panzer Army, and the Soviet breakthrough on the Italian front which rendered Army Detachment Holit incapable of any action to relieve Stalingrad, will conclude that it would have been better to insist on an immediate breakout by Sixth Army. It is fair to assume that at least some elements of the besieged formation would have managed to fight their way through to the remnants of 4th Panzer Army. Certainly the tank units and probably a number of the infantry battalions too. On the other hand, it is unlikely that the army would have remained capable of operating as a formation. Things had already taken too ominous a turn by the earliest date at which a breakout could have been attempted. Yet at the same time as the extricated elements of Sixth Army might have been joining 4th Panzer Army, the entire enemy siege forces would have been released. With that, in all probability, the fate of the whole southern wing of the German forces in the east would have been sealed, including Army Group A. I would nonetheless emphasize that the latter consideration played absolutely no part in shaping our appreciation of 24th November. Far from wanting to sacrifice 6th Army in the interest of saving the southern wing, we hoped that it would have a better chance of escape when working in conjunction with the two groups earmarked for its relief than if it tried, at this late stage, to break out on its own. My staff and I were actuated by the hope of extricating not mere military debris, but a complete army which would still be fit for further operations. It goes without saying that the name of Stalingrad and the prestige factor cut no ice with us whatever. That day, therefore, we refrained from presenting Hitler with a final demand for the breakout of 6th Army, or from ordering it on our own responsibility. One might add here that General Paulus, faced with the dilemma of whether to obey Hitler or the headquarters of his army group, would hardly have been able to opt for the latter. For the rest, it was perfectly clear to us that even if the relief groups were able to get through to 6th Army, the latter could not possibly be left at Stalingrad any longer. The essential thing to ensure was that it retained as much of its fighting power as possible in the meantime. It was much more likely to achieve this in the Stalingrad area, provided that it were properly supplied from the air, than if it were caught out in the steppes while trying to escape. The criterion of whether 6th Army could be freed in this way was twofold, however. First, would the Luftwaffe be in a position to meet the Army's vital needs? Secondly, could the Supreme Command furnish further relief forces? And if so, would it be prepared to do so? Both questions were clearly expressed in our message to OKH. Only Hitler, who as Commander-in-Chief of the Wehrmacht had power over all forces of the Army and Luftwaffe in every theatre of war, was able to judge what the prospects were and take the appropriate decision. If the decision were an affirmative one, we should be justified in shelving the desperate measure of an isolated breakout and in leaving the army at Stalingrad. Should Hitler, however, be unwilling to commit every available man to the relief of Stalingrad while there was still time, or should he indulge, against his better judgment, in illusions about the capacities of the Luftwaffe, he would be guilty of dire irresponsibility. The same may be said of those who, as it later turned out, awakened and fortified such beliefs in him, or who would not understand that the fate of 6th Army must have precedence over the demands of all other theatres. That Goering would commit the supreme frivolity of promising an adequate airlift, and then not even lay himself out to produce at least what he had available, was something no soldier could foresee. Neither, however, did we foresee to what extent Hitler would ignore all factual considerations in favour of his hold or bust theory. Who could suppose that he would accept the loss of a whole army for the sake of the name of Stalingrad? On the afternoon of 24th of November, we continued the journey from Starobielsk to Novocherkassk. 10 years before, I had travelled down the same line to Rostov to attend the manoeuvres of the Red Army in the Caucasus. On that earlier occasion, all sorts of interesting impressions had lain ahead of me. Today it was a mission as to the gravity of which my staff and I had no illusions. Time and again our thoughts went out to our beleaguered comrades at Stalingrad, despite the efforts of my ADC, Lieutenant Stahlberg, to divert us with good gramophone music and talk of other problems. He had joined our staff after the death of Peppo, having been brought to me by my former colleague, Treskov, whose nephew he was. Stahlberg remained my constant companion till the end of the war. Throughout those years he was a faithful assistant to me in all personal matters. On the morning of 26th of November, I broke my journey in Rostov to see General Hofe, the head of the German military mission to Romania, who had originally been designated as the German Chief of Staff of Antonescu's army group. He painted a most disagreeable picture of the state of the two Romanian armies on the Stalingrad front. Of their 22 original divisions, he told us, 9 were completely wiped out, 9 had run away and could not be sent into action for the time being, and 4 were still fit for battle. Given time, however, he hoped to form a few extra formations out of the wreckage. The antithesis to Hof's report was provided by a letter written to me by Marshal Antonescu. He had some bitter things to say about the Supreme Command, which he accused of not paying enough attention to his frequent warnings regarding the mounting danger in the Kremenskaya bridgehead opposite 3rd Romanian Army's front. He also complained of the way his own assumption of command had been repeatedly postponed. With every justification, moreover, the Marshal pointed out that of all Germany's allies, Romania and he personally had done most for the common cause. Of his own accord, he had made 22 divisions available for the 1942 campaign, and unlike Italy or Hungary, had unreservedly placed these under German command, despite not being bound to the Reich by any obligation of a contractual nature. His letter voiced the justified disillusionment of a soldier who sees his troops lost through the mistakes of others. Inwardly, I could not dispute the justness of the Marshal's criticisms. I wrote to tell him that as one who had not previously been involved in the events in question, I was unable to comment on his strictures myself and had passed his letter on to Hitler, at whom, of course, I knew them to be aimed. It could certainly do Hitler no harm to have to read such unvarnished criticism by his most loyal ally. Besides, the letter touched on a political question, that of confidence between allies. Antonescu mentioned that his mortal enemy, the leader of the Iron Guard, had been put beyond his reach by Himmler and was now being kept in Germany for a rainy day. The Iron Guard, a radical political organization, had earlier staged a putsch against the Antonescu regime, and initially succeeded in surrounding the Marshal's official residence. Though the Marshal had ultimately been able to put down the rising, the Iron Guard leader had escaped abroad. It was understandable that Antonescu should consider himself disloyally treated when Himmler now held a protecting hand over this man. Such underhand tactics were hardly conducive to the strengthening of an alliance. Antonescu's original reason for writing to me was to complain that German officers and men, in both their official and unofficial capacities, had been guilty of roughly handling Romanian soldiers and passing defamatory remarks about them. Although such occurrences could be accounted for by recent events and the poor showing made by many Romanian units, I naturally took immediate action. However much one might sympathise with the indignation of German troops who had been left in the lurch by neighbouring units, incidents of this kind could only damage our common cause. I have already shown what could and could not be expected of Romanian troops in various situations, but they were still our best allies and did fight bravely in many places. On 26th of November, we arrived at our new headquarters in Novocherkassk. The only guard unit available was a battalion of Cossack volunteers, who obviously considered it a special honour to do sentry duty in front of our office building. As our main channels of communication were ready the next night, we were able to take over command of Don Army Group on the morning of 27th November. The task confronting us was a two-sided one. Its chief feature, and the one on which everything depended, was the relief and rescue of 6th Army. Apart from being a priority in the humane sense, this was also vital from the operational point of view, first and foremost because there could be hardly any hope of restoring the situation on the southern wing of the Eastern Front, or indeed in the Eastern Theatre as a whole, unless the forces of 6th Army were preserved. The other side of the task, and this had to be borne in mind throughout, was the already existing danger that the entire southern wing of the German armies would be destroyed. If this were allowed to happen, it would most probably be the end of the struggle in the east, and consequently lose us the war. Should the Russians succeed in tearing through the flimsy screen, for the moment consisting mainly of Romanian remnants and German B-echelon troops and emergency units, which, leaving aside the so-called fortress